Get comfortable, dim the lights, and let your shoulders drop. Because tonight we're walking through every corner of the Fallout universe, slowly, gently, uncovering the secrets that the developers tucked away for the patient few who actually go looking. There's something soothing about a world that ended decades ago and kept going anyway, and we're going to spend the next couple of hours wandering through its quiet, dusty hallways together. No rush, no pressure, just the wasteland and the stories hiding inside it. Let's start at the very beginning, back before there was a wasteland at all. Back when Fallout was just an idea floating around a small office in Irvine, California in the early 1990s. A programmer named Tim Kaine had joined Interplay Entertainment in 1991, and for the first several months of working on what would eventually become Fallout, he was, quite literally, the only person on the project. Picture that for a second. One person, alone with a computer, building the skeleton of a game engine in his spare time, with no certainty that anyone above him would ever greenlight it into something real. He had been a fan of tabletop role-playing for years, running sessions of Dungeons & Dragons and a system called GURPS, the Generic Universal Role-Playing System, with coworkers after hours. That love of tabletop rules quietly shaped everything that came next. The original plan wasn't even to make something brand new. Interplay had previously published a game called Wasteland back in 1988, a post-nuclear adventure that had earned a small but devoted following. Brian Fargo, who ran Interplay, wanted to revisit that world, maybe even make a proper sequel. So a handful of developers sat down and tried to figure out what had made Wasteland special in the first place. They wrote up what they called a sensibilities document, identifying things like moral ambiguity, a skill-based system, tactical combat, and an attribute system as the core ingredients worth keeping. Comforting, isn't it, to think that even something as massive as Fallout started with a simple checklist of what mattered. But there was a problem. Electronic Arts held the rights to the Wasteland name, and despite some hopeful back and forth, Interplay couldn't get them back. So the team pivoted. Instead of a sequel, they would build something new, in the same spirit, but with its own identity. Tim Kaine proposed using underground vaults as the central setting, and that one idea ended up becoming the entire foundation of everything that followed. For a while, this game wasn't even called Fallout. It went by tentative titles like Vault-13, a GURPS post-nuclear adventure, because at the time, the team genuinely intended to build the game using the GURPS tabletop rule set with an official license from Steve Jackson Games. They sent over screenshots and concept art throughout 1996, and Steve Jackson's company publicly announced the partnership, calling it the first GURPS computer role-playing game ever produced by Interplay. Everything seemed to be moving along fine. There was even an April 1997 release date being floated publicly. Then, quietly, the relationship started to fracture. According to multiple developers who were there, Steve Jackson personally took issue with two specific things in the game. The first was the violent, almost gleefully grim introduction sequence. The second, and this one is the detail that always surprises people, was Vault Boy. Yes, that cheerful, thumbs-up mascot almost got the entire game's license revoked. The story behind his creation is wonderfully simple. According to Brian Fargo, the idea came to him while driving home one night. He pictured something like a deck of Monopoly cards, with a recurring cartoon character who stayed relentlessly happy no matter what happened to him, even if he was standing there with his hands blown off after a critical failure, grinning the entire time. He pitched it to an artist named Tremel Ray Isaac, who brought Vault Boy to life almost exactly as Fargo had imagined him. The team loved him immediately. Steve Jackson did not. He sent back a list of roughly 22 requested changes. The team agreed to almost all of them, but the violent intro and Vault Boy were sticking points neither side would budge on. Jackson reportedly told Interplay that without those changes, he simply wouldn't authorize the game to ship at all. So Interplay made a decision that, in hindsight, shaped the entire franchise. They dropped the GURPS license completely in March of 1997, just weeks before the planned release. Steve Jackson himself said publicly that he was caught off guard, that he had received no formal explanation, and that it came as a surprise even to the people actually building the game. Tim Kaine was given the unenviable task of figuring out how to replace an entire rule set that the game had been built around for nearly 3 years. This is where one of the most quietly remarkable moments in gaming history happened. Lead designer Christopher Taylor was given about 1 week to design a brand new attribute system from scratch, and Tim Kaine was given about 1 week to code it into the game. 1 week each. Out of that frantic sprint came SPECIAL, the seven-letter acronym for strength, perception, endurance, charisma, intelligence, agility, and luck. A system so well designed that it has now defined the entire Fallout series for nearly 3 decades, completely outliving the GURPS system it was rushed in to replace. Sometimes the best ideas in any creative project arrive not through careful planning, but through pressure and a deadline that refuses to move. The name Fallout itself almost didn't happen either. During a brainstorming session, the team threw around dozens of possible titles. Someone actually suggested Fallout, and the room rejected it, with one person reportedly pointing out that the game took place 80 years after the bombs dropped, so there technically wouldn't be any Fallout left in the air anymore. They moved on to other ideas. But Brian Fargo kept thinking about it. He started taking the game home on weekends to play it himself, and at some point, he circled back to that rejected title and decided it was the one. Even the theme song had its own quiet drama behind the scenes. The original plan was to use the 1940s song I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire by the Ink Spots, but a copyright issue blocked that idea. So the team chose a different Ink Spots track instead, one called Maybe, which became the haunting, nostalgic voice that opens the very first game. Fallout finally released in the fall of 1997. After roughly 3.5 years of development and a budget of around $3 million, a figure that sounds almost impossibly small compared to what modern Fallout games cost today. It wasn't a runaway commercial blockbuster. Estimates suggest somewhere between 100,000 and 600,000 lifetime copies sold across various reports, modest numbers, but the kind of slow-burning cult success that quietly builds an entire universe brick by brick over the following decades. And here's a small, lovely detail to close out this opening chapter with. If you ever play the original Fallout on a version of Windows newer than the one it launched on, and you set your icons to display at a large size, the game's icon doesn't show the logo anymore. It shows Tim Kaine's actual face. Nobody planned for this to become a long-term Easter egg. It was simply how the icon file was structured, but newer operating systems default to showing larger icons, which means an entire generation of modern players have unknowingly been looking at the real-life face of the man who built this universe from nothing every single time they double-click to open the game. Before we keep going deeper into the wasteland, take a second, get cozy if you haven't already, and if you don't mind, drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. I love picturing all the different time zones tucked in for this one. And if this kind of slow, detailed wander through game history is something you enjoy, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Okay, let's keep wandering. Now, let's talk about the line that started it all, the one sentence that has opened nearly every Fallout game since 1997. War. War never changes. It's become so iconic that it almost feels like it must have been workshopped for months, polished by a whole writing team. The truth is much simpler and somehow more charming. Tim Kaine wrote it himself, and according to his own recollection, it was actually his only direct writing contribution to the entire first game. One sentence, 4 words really if you don't count the repetition, and it ended up becoming the defining phrase of an entire franchise that's still being expanded nearly 30 years later. There's another small tribute hidden in the original game's credits sequence. If you type the word boom while the credits are rolling, an animation plays of Tim Kaine's head exploding. It's a strange, almost self-deprecating little joke from a developer who clearly didn't take himself too seriously, even while building something this influential. And if you wander through Fallout 2, which takes place roughly 80 years after the first game, you can stumble across a gravestone bearing his name. It reads, simply, Tim Kaine, founder, lover, fighter, programmer. A quiet, permanent monument left by his former colleagues, buried somewhere in the digital wasteland for players to find by accident. Fallout 2 itself, released just a year later in 1998, expanded the world considerably, and it leaned much harder into pop culture references and fourth wall jokes than its predecessor. The team had a specific internal rule about this, interestingly enough. References were only allowed if understanding the original source material wasn't required to still enjoy the joke. A perk in the first game called Slayer, for example, was named after the television show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but its actual gameplay effect, turning your attacks into guaranteed critical hits, worked perfectly fine as a joke even if you'd never seen a single episode. It's a clever bit of restraint that a lot of modern games forget about, where references either land cleanly on their own merit or they don't make the cut at all. The voice acting in that first game deserves a moment of appreciation too, because the cast is genuinely stacked with talent that feels almost unbelievable for a $3 million budget RPG from the late 90s. Tony Shalhoub, Keith David, Brad Garrett, Clancy Brown, David Warner, and Ron Perlman all lent their voices to various characters and narration. Ron Perlman in particular became so synonymous with the franchise's tone that his gravelly delivery of the opening narration has carried forward across multiple games since, even ones made by entirely different studios decades later. Now, let's drift towards something a little more mysterious, something that exists in a strange in-between space in Fallout history. After Interplay's financial troubles deepened in the early 2000s, the company began work on what would have been the third mainline Fallout game, developed internally at a division called Black Isle Studios under the codename Project Van Buren. This was meant to be a real-time game with the option to pause into turn-based combat, set across a sprawling map covering Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. Van Buren never got the chance to finish. Interplay's financial situation collapsed before the project could be completed, and it was formally canceled in December of 2003. For years, all that remained were scattered tech demos, leaked footage, and the lingering disappointment of fans who had been following its development. But there's a fascinating and slightly painful footnote to this story that only came to light years later, when Tim Kaine, who had left Interplay long before Van Buren even began, shared his own role in its ending. By 2003, Kaine had moved on to found Troika Games with former Fallout colleagues Leonard Boyarsky and Jason Anderson. He received a phone call from an old Interplay contact, a vice president who told him bluntly that they were planning to cancel Van Buren, that they didn't believe the team could finish it, but that there was a small chance the project could be saved if Kaine came in to evaluate it personally. The message included an unusually pointed bit of pressure too, something along the lines of, "If you don't do this, bad things will happen to other people." Kaine agreed to take a look. He crossed the street into Interplay's lobby, played a build of Van Buren for roughly 2 hours, a build that matched closely with the tech demo footage that would later leak online, and spoke with several of the developers working on it. When the executive asked Kaine for his honest assessment and how long it would take to get the game into a shippable state, Kaine's answer effectively confirmed what Interplay had already suspected. The project wasn't salvageable in the time and resources they had remaining. Looking back on it years later, Kaine reflected that he didn't think it would have ended up being a game people would have enjoyed playing in the state it was in. So, in a strange twist of fate, the man who originally created Fallout was also, indirectly, involved in confirming the cancellation of what would have been its third mainline entry. Interplay's financial troubles eventually led to the closure of Black Isle Studios entirely in 2004. And not long after, Bethesda Softworks purchased the Fallout intellectual property outright. There's one more detail worth sitting with before we move on, something Tim Kaine revealed much more recently. He's mentioned, on a podcast appearance, that he privately designed his own concept for what a Fallout 3 might have looked like, an idea that came directly from his own original team, completely separate from Van Buren. He stated plainly that he intends to never reveal the details, saying that if anything resembling his idea ever does appear in a future Fallout game, he wants to be certain it happened as a genuine coincidence rather than something taken from him. The few hints he has offered suggest it would have moved to a fully three-dimensional perspective and explored locations outside the United States, possibly touching on the post-war versions of China and Russia, since the first two games leaned so heavily into a satirical take on American jingoism. It's a quiet little mystery that will likely never be solved. A complete vision for an alternate Fallout history that exists only inside one person's memory, deliberately kept there forever. When Bethesda Game Studios took over the franchise and began building what we now know as Fallout 3, releasing in 2008, they were inheriting an enormous amount of established lore, while also needing to completely reinvent the gameplay for a first-person, fully three-dimensional world. According to designer Emile Pagliarulo, the early development process for Fallout 3 actually involved more cutting than adding. He's described it using a phrase from their lead animator at the time, who joked that instead of dealing with the usual feature creep that plagues most games, where ideas keep getting added until a project becomes unmanageable, they were instead dealing with feature seep, meaning they were constantly trimming ambitious ideas down to something achievable. One of the more interesting casualties of that process was the faction system. The original Fallout games had let players join different groups and factions throughout the wasteland, but Fallout 3 ultimately didn't include that kind of layered faction gameplay, something the team was acutely aware was missing. That gap ended up directly shaping the next chapter of the franchise's history. Once Fallout 3 was finished and Bethesda was preparing to shift its full attention toward developing The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim, the studio recognized there would be a multi-year gap before fans got another mainline Fallout game. So they reached out to Obsidian Entertainment, a studio founded by former Black Isle Studios developers, including some of the very people who had worked on the original Fallout and Fallout 2. According to Todd Howard, Obsidian was, in his words, the only choice, given their direct lineage back to the franchise's roots and their prior experience crafting a sequel to someone else's established game, having previously developed Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 for another studio's original property. The instructions Bethesda gave Obsidian were strikingly minimal. According to Howard, the entire creative direction essentially came down to one request: build something that uses factions in a meaningful way, since that was the piece Fallout 3 hadn't fully explored. Obsidian's creative director, John Gonzalez, has described their pitch internally as drawing on what he called Fallout DNA, since the team genuinely understood the franchise's tone and history from the inside. Their original pitch document to Bethesda was only 3 pages long, and they initially gave the project the working title Fallout: Sin City, before eventually settling on Fallout: New Vegas. Here's the detail that tends to genuinely surprise people when they hear it for the first time. Obsidian was given only 18 months to complete the entire game, despite having originally requested something closer to 24 months. Lead designer Josh Sawyer has talked openly about the pressure that timeline created, noting that the team was working somewhere between 40 and 50 hours a week throughout development, a demanding but not entirely unreasonable pace according to him, though it left almost no room for the kind of polish a longer schedule might have allowed. To make matters more complicated, Obsidian was working with Bethesda's Gamebryo engine for the first time, a technology they hadn't built anything with previously, which meant programmers had to spend considerable time simply maintaining and troubleshooting the engine itself, time that couldn't be spent on new content. The game's setting wasn't an arbitrary choice either. Bethesda had, in Sawyer's words, already claimed dibs on the east coast of the United States with Fallout 3, so Obsidian set their game out west instead. Sawyer drew direct inspiration from the actual history of Las Vegas, particularly its long, complicated relationship with organized crime, and he used the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 as a kind of internal cutoff point, meaning the team avoided incorporating any real-world historical references or events that occurred after that year, since the Fallout timeline diverges from our own reality somewhere around that era. To design the actual game map, Obsidian used real geographic survey data from the United States Geological Survey, combined with reference photographs that Sawyer personally took while researching the Mojave Desert region. Given the brutal timeline, a significant amount of content simply couldn't make it into the final game. There was at one point a planned post-game epilogue, allowing players to actually witness and interact with the consequences of which faction won control of Hoover Dam, rather than simply reading about it on a slideshow at the end. Dialogue lines referencing this post-dam world still technically exist in the game's files, leftover remnants of a system that was designed but never finished. Sawyer has confirmed that the decision to cut it was made relatively late in development, specifically because the area design team had fallen behind on their milestones and wouldn't have had time to build both the core required content and this additional reactive epilogue. There's also a persistent rumor among longtime fans, one that Sawyer has personally addressed and corrected, claiming that several major characters, including the antagonist Benny, were originally intended to become recruitable companions. According to Sawyer, this isn't accurate. The only character who was genuinely planned as a potential companion was a man named Ulysses, who was ultimately cut from the base game entirely during development, only to return years later as the central antagonist of the Lonesome Road expansion. The opening cinematic also went through a complete transformation. Originally, the now famous pre-rendered cutscene showing Benny shooting the player character and burying them in a shallow grave was meant to be a fully in-game script-driven sequence instead. Modders have since pieced together the leftover assets to recreate something close to that original vision, though it's noticeably rougher and less polished than what eventually shipped, which likely explains why Obsidian made the switch to a cinematic instead. Because of the demanding console hardware at the time, particularly the PlayStation 3, certain areas of the game had to be repeatedly scaled back during development. Early trailers and E3 demos showed the New Vegas Strip as a single, continuous street packed with significantly more wandering non-player characters, giving it a livelier, busier atmosphere. The performance simply couldn't hold up on console hardware, so Obsidian had to split the strip into separate, loading screen-divided sections and reduce the population density considerably. Freeside, the area surrounding the strip, saw similar reductions based on file evidence, even though there isn't surviving pre-release footage to confirm exactly how it originally looked. There's a wonderfully strange little secret buried in the game's ending slideshow sequence, too. Using console commands, players can actually locate and view a character simply named Ron the Narrator, the very figure used to deliver all of the game's narration and ending slides. He appears wearing Legion armor in-game, and he's modeled directly after the man whose voice provides that narration, Ron Perlman, the same actor whose voice has opened Fallout games since the very first one back in 1997. It's a quiet thread connecting the newest entries all the way back to the original. Let's slow down for a moment here, because this next stretch is full of small, strange details that reward close attention, the kind of thing only the most dedicated wasteland wanderers ever stumble across. Within the expansions Obsidian built for New Vegas, there's a particularly clever and slightly eerie reference hidden in the Dead Money downloadable content. Deep in a wine cellar near the bell tower, scrawled across a central pillar, are the words, "I am not your mummy," a direct nod to the gas mask-wearing ghost people, enemies found throughout that expansion, referencing the two-part Doctor Who episode, The Empty Child and the Doctor Dances, which similarly featured a haunting masked figure repeating a chillingly similar phrase. It's a reference that rewards a very specific kind of fan, someone who happens to love both post-apocalyptic wastelands and classic British science fiction television, which feels like exactly the kind of niche, lovingly specific joke that makes these games still worth digging through more than a decade later. The expansions themselves were built under an interesting creative constraint. Bethesda restricted the total combined dialogue across all 4 add-ons to no more than 10,000 spoken lines. That limitation, rather than hurting the storytelling, seems to have pushed Obsidian toward making each expansion a tightly self-contained adventure, set in its own distinct location with its own focused cast of characters, rather than trying to sprawl across the existing Mojave map. It's a reminder that creative limitations, the kind that feel frustrating in the moment, often end up producing some of the most memorable, focused storytelling, because there simply isn't room for filler. Let's turn our attention now to Fallout 4, released in 2015, a game that represented Bethesda's most significant overhaul of the core gameplay loop since the franchise made its jump to 3 dimensions back in 2008. One of the biggest internal conversations during development centered on the VATS system, the targeting mechanic that lets players pause combat to carefully select specific body parts on an enemy. Todd Howard has spoken candidly about this in interviews, acknowledging that while players genuinely loved VATS, in Fallout 3, they also tended to rely on it almost entirely, specifically because the underlying first-person shooting mechanics in that game simply weren't very satisfying on their own. His own words on the matter were refreshingly blunt, describing the baseline shooting as, in his diplomatic phrasing, a little underwhelming. So for Fallout 4, the studio set out to build something that could genuinely function as a quality first-person shooter on its own merits, without forcing players to lean on VATS as a crutch. According to Howard, the goal was to let players choose their preferred approach entirely. You could play through the entire game treating it like a traditional shooter if you wanted, or you could build your character specifically around VATS for a more tactical, RPG-focused playstyle, and either approach would feel viable and rewarding. It's a quiet but meaningful design philosophy shift, one that fundamentally changed how the game felt to control, even if the underlying systems shared a name with their predecessor. Fallout 4 is also famous, perhaps more than any other entry in the series, for the sheer density of pop culture references and hidden jokes scattered throughout its world. Take the character Codsworth, your robotic mister. Handy companion who follows you out of Vault 111 at the very beginning of the game. He's programmed to recognize and personally address you by name if you happen to choose one from a list of nearly 1,000 pre-recorded names. Most players never go looking beyond the obvious common names, but dedicated fans combed through the game's audio files and discovered an entire secondary list of names the developers clearly didn't expect most people to find. Names like Doomguy, Dragonborn, though interestingly, Dovahkiin does not trigger the same recognition, Herobrine, Skooma, and even, perhaps most charmingly, Todd Howard himself. There's also a reference to Fallout 5, recorded years before the game was ever officially announced, a quiet little wink toward the franchise's own future from inside its own files. There's an even deeper secret tucked into that same opening sequence, though, one that requires very specific timing and platform conditions to actually witness. While escaping from Vault 111 near the beginning of the game, players pass by a recreational computer terminal that lets them play a fully functional Donkey Kong-style arcade game called Red Menace. If a player wins 3 consecutive rounds of this minigame, the screen will go dark and stay that way for exactly 10 seconds. The trick is that you have to resist the urge to leave the terminal during that pause, because if you wait it out, and provided you purchased Fallout 4 through Steam with Morrowind also present on your account, the terminal will actually launch a fully playable, picture-in-picture version of the Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, right there inside Fallout 4's world. It's a staggeringly elaborate Easter egg for something so easy to miss entirely, a functioning game nested inside another game, accessible only through a very specific chain of conditions that almost feels like it was designed as a reward exclusively for the most patient and curious players. The Commonwealth, Fallout 4's name for its version of post-apocalyptic Boston, is absolutely littered with smaller environmental storytelling secrets too, the kind that don't require console commands or arcade minigames, just a willingness to look closely at the world around you. In a Cambridge warehouse, there's a location nicknamed by the community as the Plumber's Secret, a space that looks completely barren and looted at first glance, until you happen to look up and notice a collection of plungers stuck to the ceiling, each one holding loot in place. Shoot the plungers down, and the items fall with them, a tiny puzzle hidden in plain sight that most players walk right past without ever looking upward. There's a deeply moving, quietly devastating reference hidden within the Far Harbor expansion as well, set on a foggy island off the coast of the main game. If you venture into the waters just north of an area called the Nucleus, you'll find 2 human skeletons positioned in the water, one resting atop a floating wooden door, the other partially submerged, gripping its side. It's an unmistakable recreation of the famous closing scene from the 1997 film Titanic, the moment where Jack and Rose share their final words together, with countless fans over the years having joked, much like online audiences did about the film itself, that there was clearly room enough on that door for both of them. It's a strange thing to find genuinely touching, a tiny tableau of grief and old movie nostalgia, hidden quietly underwater in a game about nuclear devastation. Diamond City, the largest settlement in Fallout 4, built directly into the remains of Boston's real-life Fenway Park, carries its own seasonal secrets as well. If you happen to visit during the in-game calendar's version of Christmas or Halloween, the entire city receives unique holiday decorations that most players, focused on quest objectives rather than calendar dates, never actually witness during a normal playthrough. And within the detective agency belonging to a synthetic character named Nick Valentine, there are case files specifically referencing something called the Mysterious Stranger, a shadowy figure who has appeared, without explanation, across multiple Fallout games as a random combat encounter, occasionally helping the player out of nowhere before vanishing. Fallout 4 marked the first time the game's actually acknowledged, even in this small, oblique way, that other characters within the world itself are aware this mysterious figure exists too. Perhaps the most fascinating ongoing mystery connected to Fallout 4, though, has nothing to do with a discovered secret at all, but rather one that has, as far as anyone can confirm, never actually been found. At the 2016 DICE Summit, Todd Howard publicly stated that there was still at least one significant secret hidden somewhere in Fallout 4's enormous world, one that thousands of dedicated players had, even by that point, failed to locate. In the years since, the community has periodically resurfaced this claim, scouring terminals, hidden rooms, and obscure dialogue trees searching for whatever Howard was referring to. Some fans believe they may have found it, particularly a hidden terminal entry within the Institute that discusses how the game's synthetic coursers utilize a built-in targeting system similar to VATS, fueling years of community theorizing about whether the player character themselves might secretly be a synth. Many longtime fans and dedicated researchers consider that theory thoroughly debunked at this point, though, which means Howard's original secret, whatever it actually was, may genuinely still be sitting out there, undiscovered, a full decade after the game's release. It's a wonderfully fitting mystery for a series built almost entirely around exploration and the thrill of finding something nobody else has noticed yet. Let's drift now into something a little different. The strange experience of secrets that exist not because developers hid them cleverly, but because of pure accident, the kind of thing nobody intended for players to ever see. One of the more famous examples involves a glitch that allowed access to areas of Mass Fusion's interior in Fallout 4 that simply weren't meant to be reachable, discovered when players figured out they could use an in-game trash can to glitch their way up to otherwise inaccessible heights. It's not an Easter egg in the traditional sense. Nobody coded it as a deliberate reward, but it speaks to something genuinely charming about these massive, densely built worlds. There's always more space than any single player could realistically explore, and sometimes the most interesting discoveries come from breaking the rules slightly rather than following the intended path. This pattern of accidental discovery becomes even more pronounced once we look at Fallout 76, the franchise's first foray into a persistent online multiplayer world, released in 2018. Like most Bethesda games before it, Fallout 76 contains developer testing areas, hidden rooms tucked away outside the normal map boundaries where the team can access every item in the game for debugging and testing purposes. In a single-player game, finding one of these rooms through console commands is harmless fun. But Fallout 76 is an always-online multiplayer experience, which meant when players eventually figured out a way to access the developer room without using any console commands at all, purely through clever exploitation of the game's systems, it created a genuine problem. Bethesda ended up banning a number of accounts that had managed to slip into this restricted developer space. What happened next is the part that tends to make people laugh. Bethesda actually had to reach out directly to the banned players, asking them to explain exactly how they had pulled it off, in exchange for the possibility of having their accounts reinstated. A team of professional game developers, essentially asking their own community to explain a security flaw that the community had found before they did. Let's step back even further now, towards something that connects nearly every Fallout game ever made, a thread running underneath all of them, regardless of which studio built which installment. The Elder Scrolls series, Bethesda's other massive fantasy franchise, has been quietly woven into the Fallout universe for years, almost as a kind of inside joke between the studio and its most attentive fans. In Fallout New Vegas, built by Obsidian rather than Bethesda itself, wandering through the Freeside district reveals a series of utility poles, and if you look closely at one of them, there's a small, easily overlooked plaque that simply reads TES-04. A quiet nod to the Elder Scrolls 4, Oblivion. The same exact reference appears again in Fallout 3, on similar roadside signage scattered throughout the capital wasteland, proving the joke wasn't unique to one studio's interpretation of the world, but rather something the broader Bethesda family of developers enjoyed planting consistently. Fallout 4 took this cross-franchise wink even further, with a small, unassuming plant growing inside the Brotherhood of Steel's massive airship, the Prydwen. If you examine it closely, you'll notice it looks remarkably similar to a plant called Nirnroot, a recognizable, somewhat magical-sounding flora native to the world of Skyrim and the broader Elder Scrolls universe. The in-game lab terminal even labels this plant using the designation NRT-001, reinforcing the visual connection. It's never been officially confirmed as anything more than a playful reference, a wink rather than an actual statement about shared universes, but it's exactly the kind of detail that keeps dedicated fans theorizing for years, wondering if there's some thread connecting these two enormous, separately built worlds. There's something quietly poetic about that kind of long-running, cross-franchise inside joke, something that feels worth sitting with for a moment before we continue. These games are made by hundreds of different people across nearly 3 decades, working at different studios, often without any direct collaboration between teams separated by years of time. And yet certain small gestures keep getting passed down, almost like a tradition being handed from one set of developers to the next. A plaque referencing a sister game, a familiar plant, a shared sense of humor about the worlds they're building. It makes these massive, sprawling video games feel slightly more handmade than their scale would otherwise suggest, like there's a continuous thread of personality running underneath all that polished production value. Let's turn back to Fallout 3 for a while now, because that game in particular holds an enormous number of carefully constructed Easter eggs that reward close reading and a genuine appreciation for storytelling craft, far beyond simple pop culture nods. One of the most beloved hidden locations in the entire game is a place called the McClellan House, found within the capital Wasteland. Designer Joel Burgess has spoken about this location specifically as the Easter egg he's personally most proud of from his entire time working on the game. The house is absolutely saturated with references to author Ray Bradbury, specifically drawing from a particular short story found within his collection, The Martian Chronicles, called There Will Come Soft Rains. Inside the house, players can find 2 small skeletons resting in a bunk bedroom, and a robotic character that, if interacted with correctly, will actually read aloud a poem by the poet Sarah Teasdale, the very same poem that Bradbury's original short story borrowed its title from. Burgess has noted that the entire location only fully reveals its meaning if you already know the source material, the family's surname, the house's specific address, the presence of a dead family pet, and that recited poem all connect back to Bradbury's haunting, quiet story about an automated house continuing its routines long after the family living inside it has died. It's a remarkably literary, almost academic level of reference for a video game, the kind of detail that the vast majority of players will simply never notice, and yet it sits there patiently, fully realized, for the handful of people who do happen to recognize it. Fallout 3 leans heavily into historical references surrounding the American Civil War as well, something that makes sense given its Washington, D.C. setting. A character named Simone Cameron borrows her surname from Simon Cameron, who served as Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of War during the early 1860s. A loyal companion dog in the game is named Fourscore, a direct reference to the opening words of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. A character named Hannibal Hamlin shares his name with Lincoln's actual first vice president. Another character, Leroy Walker, references Leroy Pope Walker, the very first Confederate States Secretary of War, while Bill Seward nods toward William H. Seward, who served as United States Secretary of State throughout much of the 1860s. Even a unique weapon found in the game, Lincoln's repeater, references the type of rifle historically associated with the president himself. None of these references are ever explained outright within the game's dialogue. They simply exist, quietly, for anyone who happens to recognize the names. The game's film references run just as deep. A particular robot type known as Mr. Gutsy, when entering combat, will occasionally declare that there's nothing it likes better than the smell of plasma in the morning, an unmistakable echo of the famous line about napalm from the film Apocalypse Now. A companion character named Sharon, when switching from melee weapons to ranged combat, makes a remark referencing the Beatles song Happiness is a Warm Gun. During the game's opening sequence, set during the player character's childhood birthday celebration inside Vault 101, a bully character named Butch attempts to steal a sweet roll that was childhood to the player by an elderly resident, a running joke that Bethesda has actually carried across multiple different game franchises over the years, not just within Fallout itself. Even the title of a quest called A Nice Day for a Right Wedding is a clever play on the lyrics from Billy Idol's song White Wedding. A super mutant companion character named Fox delivers a line during his power attacks, declaring it's time to die. A direct quote pulled from the film Blade Runner. There's a particularly clever bit of programmer humor buried in the game's dialogue files, too. A RoboBrain character, when asked a particular question, responds by asking if you're still there, a line that an internal script note, later uncovered by dedicated fans digging through the game's files, explicitly describes as an homage to the video game Portal. It's a reminder that these little references aren't only meant for players to discover. Sometimes they're inside jokes the developers leave for each other, buried in code comments never intended to be seen by the public at all, until persistent digging eventually surfaces them anyway. Now, let's slow down again, settle into a quieter rhythm, and talk about something a little more reflective: the way Fallout games have repeatedly grappled with their own legacy across different developers and different eras. When Fallout 3 launched in 2008, it carried with it a distinctive, heavily saturated green visual filter that became one of the game's most immediately recognizable and most debated stylistic choices. Some players loved the way it reinforced the sickly, irradiated atmosphere of the capital wasteland. Others found it oppressive after long play sessions. In a more recent interview, Tim Kaine shared a detail about this filter that genuinely surprised longtime fans, revealing that he personally never noticed the green tint existed at all due to his own colorblindness. He recalled being invited by Todd Howard to see Fallout 3 in person at E3 in 2008, before the game had launched, and being completely captivated by the level of environmental detail, recognizing actual Washington, D.C. landmarks like the metro stations and the Washington Monument rendered faithfully into the game's ruined world. For him, that famous green color simply wasn't something he could perceive, even as it became one of the most discussed and divisive aesthetic choices the developers internally fought to maintain consistently throughout the entire game. It's a small story, but it sits with you in an interesting way. Something that became such a defining, deliberately crafted visual signature for an entire game, something the development team reportedly reworked their color grading multiple times to get exactly right, was completely invisible to one of the very people whose creative legacy that game was built upon. Video games, like any creative medium, end up experienced differently by every single person who encounters them, sometimes in ways the creators themselves never anticipated, and sometimes in ways that even connect back to the people who started the whole journey decades earlier, without those people ever fully seeing the result the same way everyone else does. Let's shift gears now and spend some time wandering through smaller, stranger corners of the franchise, the kind of details that don't necessarily fit into a single game's chapter but deserve attention on their own. Fallout New Vegas, for instance, hides a particularly elaborate Easter egg tucked within the Honest Hearts expansion, set in Zion Canyon, far removed from the neon glow of the Strip. There's a small creature hidden in the Old World Blues expansion as well, one the community has come to understand you absolutely should not feed after midnight, an unmistakable wink toward the 1984 film Gremlins. In an area called Higgs Village, within the same expansion's strange, surreal setting, there's an unmarked backyard belonging to house number 103 that holds its own small surprise, a doghouse that now belongs to a tiny but ferociously powerful Deathclaw, deliberately named Stripe, after the antagonist Gremlin from that very same film. According to community documentation, this small creature has nearly the same number of hit points as some of the most dangerous legendary Deathclaws found elsewhere in the game, despite his comically diminutive size, a joke about underestimating small, cute-looking threats that plays out literally in the game's combat mechanics. There's a small piece of continuity that connects Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas together too, one that requires a genuinely attentive eye to notice. In Fallout 3, the player character's parents, James and Catherine, share a treasured photograph together, a quiet symbol of the love story that frames much of that game's emotional core. If you travel to a completely different game, built by a different studio, set in a different region of the country entirely, and explore a location called Vault-21 in New Vegas, you'll find the exact same photograph resting beside a character's bed. It's almost certainly a case of asset reuse between studios working from a shared library of resources rather than any intentional in-universe explanation. But it's still a charming little thread to imagine, the notion that some echo of that particular love story somehow drifted from the East Coast all the way out to the Mojave Desert, even if the practical reality is simply that two different teams pulled from the same folder of available game assets. Let's talk for a while now about something genuinely unusual within Fallout lore, the recurring figure known across multiple games as the mysterious stranger. This character has appeared, in some form, dating all the way back to the very first Fallout game released in 1997, typically manifesting as a random, unexplained combat encounter where a shadowy figure in a trench coat and fedora appears without warning, fires a devastating shot at one of your enemies, and then disappears just as suddenly as they arrived, never speaking, never explaining who they are or why they helped. For more than 2 decades across multiple games and multiple developers, this character was never given any formal explanation within the lore itself. Fallout 4 marked a quiet but meaningful shift in that tradition, becoming the first game to actually acknowledge, even just slightly, that other characters living inside this world are aware the mysterious stranger exists too. Within Diamond City's detective agency, belonging to the synthetic investigator Nick Valentine, players can discover actual case files specifically dedicated to documenting reported sightings of this figure. The notes don't resolve the mystery in any meaningful way. They offer no concrete answers about who or what the mysterious stranger actually is, but their mere existence within the game's world represents a small but significant moment of self-awareness from the franchise, acknowledging a recurring secret that fans had been quietly tracking and wondering about for nearly 20 years by that point. It's worth pausing here to appreciate something about long-running game franchises in general, something that becomes especially clear when you spend enough time studying one as closely as we have been tonight. Secrets like the mysterious stranger only become genuinely meaningful because of how much time has passed, because of how many different teams of developers across different studios, different decades, and different technological eras have all chosen, independently, to keep gesturing toward the same unexplained figure rather than simply explaining him away. There's a kind of restraint in that decision that feels almost rare in modern entertainment, where audiences often expect every mystery to eventually receive a tidy, complete explanation. The mysterious stranger has been allowed to remain exactly that, mysterious, for nearly 30 years now, across an entire franchise built by dozens of different writers who all apparently agreed, without ever needing to discuss it explicitly, that some questions are simply more interesting left unanswered. Let's slow down even further and spend some time with the smaller, quieter forms of world building that Fallout games are particularly known for, the kind that don't rely on jokes or references at all, but simply on environmental storytelling, letting players piece together small human tragedies and stories from the objects left, scattered around an abandoned location. Throughout Fallout 4's Commonwealth, there are countless tiny scenes like this. A skeleton posed in an unusual way, a handwritten note left on a desk, a collection of objects arranged just specifically enough to suggest a story without ever stating it outright. These moments don't function as traditional Easter eggs in the sense of referencing outside media, but they represent perhaps the most consistently impressive form of secret storytelling the franchise has ever produced. The patient, careful construction of an entire implied narrative using nothing more than careful object placement and environmental design. One of the better-known examples of this kind of storytelling exists in a location simply known among the community as the Crazy Cat Cabin, an unmarked house found southeast of Walden Pond in Fallout 4. By this point, after years of dedicated community exploration and online documentation, this particular location has become so widely known that it almost feels strange to even call it a secret anymore, but it still represents exactly the kind of small, self-contained narrative the developers excelled at building. It's the kind of location that doesn't advance any quest, doesn't reward you with anything particularly valuable, and exists purely to be discovered, to make the world feel slightly more lived in and slightly more haunted by the ordinary, quiet tragedies of people who never got a proper happy ending. Let's return now to a slightly more technical, behind-the-scenes corner of Fallout history, the strange and genuinely surprising legal drama surrounding what would have eventually become a Fallout massively multiplayer online game. After Bethesda Softworks acquired the Fallout intellectual property from Interplay, the original company actually retained the rights to develop a specific kind of online multiplayer Fallout title, something codenamed Project V13. Development on this project entered production around 2008, but progress stalled considerably. By 2009, Bethesda had filed a lawsuit against Interplay, alleging that the company had violated the terms of their licensing agreement, specifically claiming that meaningful development on the project hadn't actually begun despite Interplay's public statements suggesting otherwise. This legal dispute dragged on for roughly 3 years, before finally reaching a settlement in January of 2012. The terms of that settlement included the complete cancellation of the planned Fallout Online project, along with Interplay formally transferring every remaining right connected to the franchise over to Bethesda entirely. Interestingly, the canceled project's underlying technology and codebase didn't simply vanish afterward. It was reportedly revived under an entirely different, unrelated name and concept, eventually becoming something called Mayan Apocalypse, a project with no remaining connection to the Fallout universe whatsoever. It's a strange little postscript to the franchise's complicated corporate history, a reminder that behind every game we actually get to play, there are countless canceled, reshaped, and quietly abandoned projects that never made it to release, sometimes surviving only in fragments repurposed for something else entirely. Let's drift towards something a little more lighthearted now. A brief detour through some of the smaller, stranger jokes scattered throughout Fallout 4 specifically, since that game in particular seems to have embraced humor and pop culture saturation more thoroughly than perhaps any entry before it. There's a memorable junk item players can collect throughout the Commonwealth called a flux sensor, an item whose primary practical purpose is simply being broken down into crafting components for settlement building. Buried within that seemingly mundane item's description and design, though, is a quiet reference to the science fiction horror film Alien, a small joke hidden inside an object most players will pick up dozens of times without ever reading closely enough to notice the connection. There's also a fully developed, somewhat hidden alien encounter built directly into the game's world, separate from the more well-known crashed UFO sequence found through the main questline. If a player reaches character level 20, and travels toward an area called the Old Gullet Sinkhole, near the Greentop Nursery, and certain specific conditions are met, they'll witness a UFO crash land nearby. Investigating the crash site reveals not just the wreckage, but a nearby cave containing a hostile alien creature. Defeating it rewards players with the Alien Blaster, a genuinely unique and powerful weapon that exists nowhere else in the game, a small science fiction detour tucked quietly into a game otherwise grounded in nuclear apocalypse and Cold War paranoia. And there's one more small, quietly impressive detail worth sharing before we move toward the closing stretch of tonight's journey. Throughout Fallout 4, there's an in-game phone number, 1-888-4 Vault-Tec, that's noticeably longer than a typical American phone number format. If you actually dial that number in real life, you're greeted by a genuine, fully produced voicemail message themed entirely around the in-game Vault-Tec Corporation, explaining that an unexpected surge of incoming calls has overwhelmed their phone lines. It's an entirely optional, easily missed touch that exists purely for the curious, the kind of player who decides, almost on a whim, to actually dial a phone number they noticed scrawled on a poster somewhere in the game's world, and gets rewarded with a small piece of genuine, dedicated craftsmanship for that curiosity. Let's take a breath here, settle back in, and think for a moment about what all of these scattered details actually add up to when you step back and look at the bigger picture. Across nearly 3 decades, across multiple completely different development studios, across shifting technology, shifting corporate ownership, and shifting creative leadership, the Fallout franchise has remained remarkably consistent in one particular way. Every single team that has ever touched this universe, from a handful of programmers crammed into a small Interplay office in the early 90s, to the much larger, more resourced teams at Bethesda and Obsidian decades later, has clearly understood that the small details matter just as much as the big ones. A hidden plaque referencing a sister game, a poem read by a robot inside an abandoned house, a phone number that actually works if you bother to dial it. None of these things are necessary for the games to function. None of them advance any quest or unlock any meaningful reward most of the time. They exist purely because the people building these worlds genuinely cared about making them feel real, layered, and worth exploring patiently, rather than simply rushing toward the next objective marker. There's something worth sitting with in that thought as we start winding down tonight. Something almost meditative about it if you let yourself dwell there for a moment. These games are, fundamentally, about survival after devastating loss, about communities and individuals trying to rebuild some kind of meaning and stability after everything familiar has been destroyed. And yet the people who actually build these worlds keep choosing, again and again, across every single installment, to fill that devastation with small moments of genuine care and craftsmanship. A wedding photograph carried across 2 different games built by 2 different studios. A reference to a beloved author's short story, fully realized down to the smallest detail, hidden inside a single, unremarkable-looking house that most players will simply walk past. It's a strange kind of optimism buried underneath all that rubble and radiation, the idea that even in a story about the absolute worst version of human history, there's still room for careful, deliberate beauty, if you're patient enough to go looking for it. Let's slow down for a while and talk about 2 pieces of design that you've probably thought about 100 times without ever really sitting with their history: the Pip-Boy and Nuka-Cola, because both of them carry small, interesting stories of their own. The Pip-Boy, that wrist-mounted computer every Vault Dweller straps on within the first few minutes of any Fallout game, has remained one of the series' most consistent visual identifiers since 1997. Its boxy, olive-green casing, its single, small screen, its satisfying clicking dials, all of it was designed to look like something that could plausibly have been built using 1950s-era technology, reflecting the franchise's now signature aesthetic choice of imagining a future that branched off from our own history sometime around the middle of the 20th century, one where vacuum tubes and analog dials kept advancing instead of being replaced by the sleek minimalism we associate with real-world modern computing. That retro-futuristic decision, choosing to imagine advanced technology built using outdated, chunky design language, became one of the single most defining visual choices in the entire franchise, and the Pip-Boy is probably its purest, most recognizable expression. When Fallout 4 released in 2015, Bethesda took that design philosophy a step further by actually manufacturing a real, physical Pip-Boy accessory as part of certain special editions of the game, a wearable plastic device that could hold a smartphone inside it, letting players genuinely strap a piece of this fictional 1950s future onto their own wrist while playing. It's a small, lovely example of a fictional object becoming so beloved that an entire industry decided it was worth manufacturing in real life, just so fans could hold a piece of it in their hands. Nuka-Cola carries its own quietly interesting design philosophy too. Within the game's fiction, it's presented as the wasteland's most iconic soft drink, a deliberately exaggerated parody of mid-century American consumer culture and the way soda branding from that era leaned so heavily into patriotic, almost propagandistic imagery. Throughout the games, players encounter dozens of variations: abandoned bottling plants, promotional posters, vending machines, and eventually, in Fallout 4's Nuka World expansion, an entire abandoned theme park built around the brand, allowing players to wander through what amounts to a fully realized, satirical recreation of mid-century American amusement park culture, the kind of cheerful, slightly hollow commercial optimism that the franchise has always loved gently mocking. It's a clever piece of long-term world building. The way this one fictional soda brand has been allowed to grow and accumulate its own internal history and aesthetic identity across multiple games and nearly 3 decades, becoming almost as recognizable a piece of the franchise's visual language as Vault-Boy himself. Let's turn now toward Fallout 2, because that 1998 sequel deserves a little more time than we've given it so far tonight, particularly since it expanded the franchise's sense of humor in ways that occasionally push the boundaries of what a video game from that era typically attempted. The game leaned considerably harder into pop culture parody than its predecessor, including multiple special random encounters built specifically around referencing Monty Python and the Holy Grail and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, 2 beloved pieces of British comedy that clearly resonated strongly with the writing team. There's also a recurring strain of self-aware, fourth-wall-breaking dialogue scattered throughout the game, moments where characters seem to openly acknowledge that they exist within a video game, referencing mechanics and systems directly rather than maintaining strict immersion. It's a stylistic choice that feels distinctly of its era, the late 90s having been a period when many role-playing games were experimenting with how much self-awareness and meta-humor they could fold into otherwise serious storytelling, without breaking the emotional weight of the experience entirely. Fallout 2 also introduced considerably more advanced systems for tracking how non-player characters and entire towns reacted to the player's choices and reputation, building meaningfully on the foundation the first game had established. Small interactions, like the ability to push past a person blocking a doorway, might sound like a minor mechanical addition when described plainly, but it speaks to the kind of granular, patient attention to player experience that the development team brought to even the smallest interactions, refusing to let minor frustrations like a blocked doorway interrupt the flow of exploration. Let's spend some time now with a stranger, more obscure branch of the franchise's history, the various spin-off titles that exist somewhat outside the mainline numbered games, the kind of entries that even dedicated fans sometimes forget were ever made. Fallout Tactics, Brotherhood of Steel, released in the early 2000s, shifted the franchise toward a more tactically focused, squad-based combat experience, developed not by the original Black Isle team but by separate studios brought in specifically for that project. For years, its place within official franchise canon remained somewhat ambiguous and debated among fans, with some treating it as a side story existing outside the primary timeline. That ambiguity was eventually resolved, at least publicly, when Bethesda's design director Emile Pagliarulo shared an official franchise timeline, confirming that Fallout Tactics is indeed considered canon within the broader history of the series, a clarification that came years after the game's original release, during the renewed wave of interest and scrutiny the franchise received following the 2024 television adaptation. There was also a separate, considerably less fondly remembered spin-off simply called Fallout: Brotherhood of Steel, released for consoles in the mid-2000s, an action-focused game with lighter role-playing elements that arrived after Interplay had already closed Black Isle Studios. It's rarely discussed with the same affection reserved for the mainline numbered entries, and it occupies an interesting, somewhat uncomfortable place in franchise history, a reminder that not every attempt to expand a beloved universe lands successfully, even when it's made by people working with genuine access to the source material and brand. Most longtime fans tend to treat it as a curious footnote rather than essential history, but it's worth acknowledging as part of the complete, sometimes messy picture of how this franchise grew and stumbled across different studios and different eras before eventually settling into the form most modern players recognize today. Let's drift back toward Fallout 3 once more, because we've only scratched the surface of the expansions Bethesda built for that game, each one adding its own distinct flavor and hidden details to the capital wasteland's surrounding mythology. The Pit, set within the ruins of post-war Pittsburgh, introduced a darker, more morally complicated narrative centered around slavery and industrial survival, considerably grimmer in tone than much of the base game's content. Within that expansion, there's a moment of dialogue where a character demands the player hand over their clothes immediately, a direct lift from Arnold Schwarzenegger's iconic introduction in the original Terminator film, transplanted almost word for word into the wasteland's own grim industrial setting. It's a strange, almost jarring tonal choice when you think about it, borrowing a line from a science fiction action film and dropping it into a story about forced labor and survival. But it speaks to how thoroughly these games blend genuine emotional weight with playful, sometimes incongruous pop culture humor, trusting players to hold both registers simultaneously without one undermining the other. Point Lookout, another Fallout 3 expansion, leaned into a swampy, almost gothic horror-inspired setting, drawing tonal inspiration from films and folklore about isolated, superstitious rural communities. Mothership Zeta took the franchise in an entirely different direction, sending players aboard a genuine alien spacecraft, complete with its own questline title, The Legend of Zeta, an unmistakable, playful nod toward the long-running Legend of Zelda game franchise. It's a reminder that even within a single game's collection of expansions, Bethesda's writers were willing to shift tone dramatically, moving from grim industrial slavery narratives to swampy horror to outright science fiction comedy, all within the same overarching game and the same underlying engine, trusting that players would be willing to follow the story wherever it decided to wander next. Operation Anchorage, the first expansion released for Fallout 3, took yet another distinct approach, presenting players with a simulated recreation of a pre-war military campaign in Alaska, an entirely separate, self-contained combat experience built using the framework of a training simulation within the game's fiction. It allowed the development team to explore a completely different visual aesthetic, a snowy, militarized battlefield, without needing to justify its existence within the established post-apocalyptic timeline, since the entire experience exists as a kind of historical recreation rather than a genuine present-day location. Broken Steel, the expansion that followed, extended the base game's story beyond its original ending, addressing a significant point of criticism from players and critics alike who felt that Fallout 3's initial conclusion arrived too abruptly and didn't allow for any meaningful continuation of the Wasteland story. Afterward, let's turn back toward New Vegas one final time before we continue forward, because there are still a handful of details from its various expansions worth sitting with for a moment. Lonesome Road, the final expansion released for the game, brought back the previously cut companion character Ulysses, the same figure Josh Sawyer has confirmed was the only character genuinely planned as a recruitable companion during the base game's original development, before time constraints forced Obsidian to remove him entirely. His eventual return as the central antagonist of this final expansion feels almost like a kind of creative redemption, a character who never got his proper moment in the spotlight during the rushed 18-month development cycle of the main game. Finally receiving a fully realized story years later, once Obsidian had the additional time and resources to give him the attention his concept always deserved. There's also a particularly memorable, slightly absurd Easter egg tucked into that same expansion, accessible only if a player has activated the game's Wild Wasteland trait, a special character creation option specifically designed to unlock a collection of stranger, more overtly comedic random encounters and references scattered throughout the game's world. If a player chooses to detonate nuclear weapons against both the NCR and Caesar's Legion simultaneously during Lonesome Road's climax, the resulting ending slide actually quotes Charlton Heston and displays imagery directly referencing the conclusion of the original 1968 Planet of the Apes film, complete with its iconic, devastating final reveal. It's an almost theatrically dark joke, reserved specifically for players who deliberately chose the most apocalyptically destructive possible ending available to them, rewarding that choice with one of the most cinematically referential Easter eggs found anywhere in the entire franchise. Let's settle into a quieter stretch now and spend some time with Fallout 76, since we touched on its developer room controversy earlier, but there's more worth exploring about how that particular game approached the franchise's long-running tradition of hidden secrets within an entirely new, persistent online format. Unlike every mainline Fallout game before it, Fallout 76 was built as an always-online, persistent multiplayer experience, which fundamentally changed how secrets and hidden content could function within its world. In a traditional single-player Fallout game, finding a developer testing room through console commands is essentially harmless, a private discovery that affects nobody except the individual player curious enough to go looking. Within Fallout 76's shared, persistent world, the same kind of discovery carries entirely different implications, since any exploit or hidden access point discovered by one player potentially affects the broader community and the game's overall economy and balance. This tension between the franchise's traditional love of hidden, easily exploitable secrets and the practical necessities of maintaining a stable, fair multiplayer environment created some genuinely fascinating friction throughout Fallout 76's ongoing development and updates. It's a useful reminder of how much a game's underlying technical structure can reshape even its most fundamental creative traditions. The same spirit of curious exploration that defined finding Tim Kane's hidden face in an old desktop icon or dialing a fictional phone number just to see what happens suddenly carries real consequences and complications once that exploration happens inside a shared, persistent world, where thousands of other players are simultaneously inhabiting the same space. Let's spend some time now reflecting on something a little different. The way this franchise has handled the actual passage of time within its own fiction, something that becomes increasingly complicated the longer any long-running series continues. The original 997 Fallout begins in the year 2161, a full 84 years after the bombs that devastated the world initially fell. Fallout 2 jumps forward roughly another 80 years from there. Fallout 3 is set in 2277, 200 years after the war. Fallout New Vegas takes place just 4 years later, in 2281. Fallout 4 then shifts backward in a sense, beginning its story on the actual day the bombs dropped, October 23, 2077, before jumping forward 210 years through the magic of Vault cryogenic suspension, landing the player in 2287. Fallout 76 then shifts backward again chronologically, taking place earliest of all the mainline games within the established timeline, beginning in 2102, just 25 years after the war itself, making it, despite being released after every other mainline numbered entry except the original 2 games, actually the earliest set story within the entire franchise's internal chronology. There's something quietly fascinating about a franchise willing to keep jumping backward and forward through its own internal timeline like that, rather than simply marching forward chronologically with each new release, the way most long-running franchises typically do. It suggests a confidence in the underlying world building itself, a trust that the setting is rich and stable enough to support stories told from wildly different points along its timeline without losing coherence, whether that's a story unfolding mere weeks after civilization's collapse or one unfolding more than 2 centuries later, after entire new societies and political structures have had time to rise, evolve, and sometimes collapse all over again. Let's spend a little more time appreciating something about the franchise's musical identity too. Since the curated soundtrack of pre-war American songs has become almost as recognizable a piece of Fallout's identity as Vault Boy or the Pip-Boy itself. Beginning with that original choice to use Inkspot's recordings for the first game, despite the copyright complications that ultimately forced a substitution, the franchise has consistently leaned on genuine archival recordings from the 1940s and 50s, played through in-game radio stations, to reinforce its retro-futuristic atmosphere. This approach does something genuinely clever from a world-building perspective, allowing players to hear actual historical music exactly as someone living in this fictional, irradiated wasteland might hear it themselves, filtered through the same crackling, low-fidelity radio broadcast technology that the in-game characters would have access to. It transforms something as simple as background music into another quiet piece of environmental storytelling, reinforcing the sense that this world genuinely branched away from our own reality sometime around the middle of the 20th century, freezing its popular culture in amber, while everything else around it continued to mutate and decay. Let's bring our attention back, one final time, to the people behind all of this, because it feels important, especially this late into such a long journey together, to remember that every single secret we've discussed tonight exists because real, specific human beings chose to put it there, often without any expectation that most players would ever actually find it. Joel Burgess built an entire literary tribute into a single, unremarkable-looking house, fully aware that the overwhelming majority of players would simply walk past it without a second glance, choosing to build it with that level of care anyway. Tim Kaine wrote 4 words that ended up defining an entire multi-decade media franchise, then quietly stepped back from the project not long afterward, leaving behind a gravestone bearing his name buried somewhere in a sequel he barely had any involvement in creating. Josh Sawyer and his team at Obsidian built one of the most beloved entries in the entire series under a brutally compressed 18-month deadline, somehow still finding the time and care to hide a tiny, lovingly specific Doctor Who reference inside a wine cellar that most players would never think to fully explore. It's worth sitting with that thought as our time together tonight starts winding down. Every hidden detail, every quiet Easter egg, every carefully placed reference represents a small act of generosity from someone who didn't strictly need to include it at all. Nobody would have noticed its absence. The games would have functioned identically without any of it. And yet, again and again, across nearly 3 decades and countless different developers, the choice was made to include these things anyway, purely because someone, somewhere, decided that the world deserved that extra layer of care, on the off chance that someone patient enough might eventually go looking and find it waiting there for them. Let's spend some time now with the factions themselves. the large, sprawling organizations that have given each Fallout game its political backbone, because the way these groups have evolved across different games and different writing teams says a great deal about how carefully this universe has been maintained over the decades. The Brotherhood of Steel began in the original 1997 game as a relatively small, secretive order of technology hoarding survivors descended from pre-war American military personnel who had access to power armor and advanced weaponry when the bombs fell. Their founding philosophy centered on a kind of cautious isolationism, the belief that advanced technology was simply too dangerous to be freely distributed throughout a wasteland still recovering from the consequences of humanity's last major technological catastrophe. By the time Fallout 3 introduced its own East Coast chapter of the Brotherhood, the organization had noticeably shifted its philosophy, becoming considerably more willing to intervene directly in local conflicts and protect ordinary wasteland communities, a meaningful ideological evolution that different writing teams, working years, and even decades apart chose to develop organically rather than simply repeating the same characterization across every game. Fallout 4 pushed that evolution even further, presenting a version of the Brotherhood that had grown considerably more militant and crusade-like in its approach, arriving in the Commonwealth aboard a massive airship called the Prydwen, with the explicit goal of purging the region of what they considered dangerous technological and biological threats, particularly synthetic humans and mutated creatures. It's a fascinating thread to follow across multiple games, watching a single faction's founding philosophy slowly drift and mutate across different regional chapters and different eras, the same way real-world organizations and ideologies tend to splinter and evolve as they spread across different contexts and generations of leadership. The Enclave, by contrast, represents something considerably more sinister within the franchise's political landscape, presented across multiple games as the direct ideological and, in some interpretations, literal descendant of the pre-war United States government, having survived the initial nuclear devastation through access to secure facilities and resources unavailable to ordinary wasteland survivors. Their recurring storyline across Fallout 2, Fallout 3, and various other entries typically positions them as a kind of cautionary tale about unchecked institutional power, an organization so thoroughly convinced of its own legitimacy and authority that it becomes willing to commit genuinely horrifying acts against wasteland survivors, viewing them as inferior remnants unworthy of inclusion in whatever vision of restored American civilization the Enclave happens to be pursuing at any given moment. The Institute, introduced as the central antagonistic faction of Fallout 4, took this exploration of institutional overreach in a slightly different direction, presenting an underground scientific organization whose members genuinely believe they're working toward humanity's long-term benefit through technological advancement and the development of increasingly sophisticated synthetic humans, even while their methods involve considerable secrecy, manipulation, and a fairly callous disregard for the immediate well-being of the surface-dwelling communities they study and occasionally infiltrate. The reveal that the Institute's leader, known as Father, is actually the player character's long-lost son, aged decades beyond his apparent years through the same kind of technology that kept the player in cryogenic stasis, remains one of the more emotionally complicated narrative twists in the franchise's history, deliberately complicating what might otherwise have been a straightforward villain by tying the organization's leadership directly to the player's own deepest personal loss. Let's spend a little time now with the robotic companions and characters that have populated this franchise since its earliest days, because robots occupy a particularly interesting narrative space within Fallout, often serving as some of the most emotionally resonant characters in any given game, despite, or perhaps because of, their fundamentally mechanical nature. Codsworth, the Mister, handy unit who greets the player character at the very beginning of Fallout 4, having faithfully maintained the family home for the entire 210 years his owners spent in cryogenic suspension, represents a particularly poignant example of this. His characterization leans heavily into a kind of old-fashioned, almost butler-like loyalty and politeness, a programmed personality that never wavers, even as he gradually comes to understand the full scope of the tragedy that's befallen the family. He's spent literal centuries faithfully serving. There's something genuinely moving about a character built entirely from pre-war programming, incapable of fully processing grief the way a human character might, continuing to address an absent infant and a deceased spouse with the same unwavering, gentle formality he would have used the day the bombs fell, simply because nothing in his programming has ever told him to stop. Nick Valentine, the synthetic detective introduced in Fallout 4, occupies a similarly thoughtful narrative space, built using the memories and personality of a real pre-war private investigator, transplanted into a synthetic body that's since deteriorated considerably from its original sleek design, leaving him with a visibly damaged, almost noir-appropriate appearance that perfectly suits his hard-boiled detective characterization. His entire existence raises uncomfortable, genuinely interesting philosophical questions about identity and continuity that the game never fully resolves, asking whether a consciousness built from someone else's memories and personality traits constitutes a genuine continuation of that original person, or something else entirely, something new, wearing a borrowed identity. The game wisely never forces players toward a definitive answer, allowing Nick himself to grapple with that uncertainty throughout his own personal questline, genuinely unsure himself whether he's a man or merely a very convincing imitation of one. Let's spend some time now with the radio personalities who've narrated different wasteland regions across various games, because these characters have consistently served as some of the franchise's most beloved, purely auditory pieces of world building. 3Dog, the gravelly-voiced host of Galaxy News Radio throughout Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland, became an unexpectedly beloved character despite never actually appearing in person anywhere within the game's explorable world, existing purely as a voice broadcasting commentary, music, and updates about the player's own reputation and actions throughout the wasteland. There's something quietly clever about that design choice, allowing a radio host character to comment directly on the player's choices and growing reputation, effectively turning an ambient background radio station into a kind of ongoing, dynamic narrative commentary that responds to how each individual player actually chooses to navigate the game's world. Mr. New Vegas, the smooth, unflappable radio host broadcasting throughout the Mojave Wasteland in Fallout New Vegas, took a markedly different tonal approach, presenting a calm, almost soothing voice amid the considerably more politically charged, faction-driven conflict unfolding throughout that particular game's story. His scripted news reports and music selections were designed to evoke the smooth, professional polish of genuine mid-century American radio broadcasting, reinforcing the game's deliberate Las Vegas-inspired aesthetic even through something as seemingly minor as background ambient audio. There's documented evidence within the game's unused files of additional news reports that were recorded but never actually implemented, specifically reports detailing the various possible outcomes of the game's multiple distinct endings, content that exists purely because the writing team apparently wanted to fully flesh out how this character would react to every conceivable conclusion the player might reach, even knowing that any individual playthrough would only ever experience one of those endings and therefore only ever hear one corresponding set of news updates. Let's turn our attention now towards something a little more recent in the franchise's overall history, the considerable cultural resurgence the entire series experienced following the release of the live-action Fallout television series in April of 2024. Produced for Amazon, the show represented the first major live-action adaptation of the franchise, and it arrived carrying considerable pressure given the passionate, sometimes notoriously difficult-to-please fanbase the games had cultivated across nearly 3 decades. The show's creative team made a deliberate choice to set its story within the established game timeline, rather than creating an entirely separate, disconnected continuity, a decision that brought both excitement and considerable scrutiny from longtime fans eager to see how faithfully the show's writers would handle decades of accumulated lore and continuity. The show's success had a genuinely remarkable, measurable impact on the older games themselves. Following its release, data tracking services reported significant spikes in player counts across multiple older Fallout titles, with the original 1,997 game alone reportedly experiencing something in the neighborhood of a 160% increase in concurrent players on digital storefronts, an extraordinary resurgence for a game that was, by that point, nearly 30 years old. It's a genuinely lovely example of how successful adaptations in other media can breathe entirely new life into decades-old creative work, introducing audiences who may have only known the franchise through its more recent, flashier entries to the considerably more modest, isometric, turn-based origins of the entire universe. A world built on a $3 million budget by a small team working in a converted office space, suddenly finding new relevance and a new audience decades after its original, comparatively quiet release. Let's spend some time now thinking about the modding community that's grown up around this franchise over the decades, because it represents another genuinely important piece of how these games have continued to live and evolve long after their initial release windows closed. Bethesda's particular approach to game development, building titles using internally developed engines that are deliberately left relatively open and accessible to community modification, has allowed an extraordinarily dedicated community of amateur and semi-professional developers to continue expanding, repairing, and reimagining these games years and even decades after their original release. Fallout New Vegas, in particular, has benefited enormously from this kind of sustained community support, with dedicated fan projects working to restore cut content, fix lingering technical issues that Obsidian's rushed 18-month development timeline never allowed the original team to properly address, and even build entirely new, original questlines and regions using the existing game's engine and assets as a foundation. There's something genuinely moving about that kind of sustained community devotion. Players who weren't satisfied simply experiencing these games as released, choosing instead to dedicate countless unpaid hours toward repairing, restoring, and expanding worlds that professional development teams never had sufficient time or resources to fully realize themselves. It speaks to something larger about what makes Fallout specifically, among all the various long-running game franchises that exist, particularly susceptible to this kind of intense, sustained fan devotion. These are worlds built, from their very earliest conception, around the idea of patient, careful exploration, rewarding curious players with hidden details and stories. It makes a certain kind of sense that the community surrounding these games would eventually want to participate directly in that same tradition, adding their own carefully hidden details and stories to worlds they've grown to love over years or even decades of repeated exploration. Let's slow down even further now, settling into something closer to a genuine meditation on what we've spent all this time exploring together tonight, because there's a particular emotional through line connecting nearly everything we've discussed, something worth naming explicitly before we finally let this journey come to its close. Every secret, every Easter egg, every carefully buried reference we've wandered through together across these past couple of hours shares one consistent quality. They all exist as evidence of genuine, sustained human care, applied patiently across decades by people who frequently had every practical reason to cut corners and simply didn't. Tim Kaine, working largely alone for the first several months of an uncertain, underfunded project, still found time to write a poem worthy opening line and bury his own face inside a desktop icon as a quiet joke for whoever happened to look closely enough someday to find it. Joel Burgess, working within a much larger, more corporate development structure at Bethesda years later, still found room to construct an entire literary tribute that the overwhelming majority of players would simply never notice. Josh Sawyer's team at Obsidian, crushed under an almost impossibly compressed development timeline, still managed to hide a perfectly specific, lovingly crafted Doctor Who reference inside a single wine cellar most players would walk straight past. None of these choices were necessary. None of them were demanded by any producer or publisher concerned primarily with shipping dates and budget constraints. They happened because, again and again, across nearly 30 years and multiple completely different studios, the people actually building this universe consistently chose to treat it as something worth caring for deeply, even in its smallest, most easily overlooked corners. Let's spend just a little more time before we finally close things out tonight, considering what all of this might mean beyond the specific context of video game development, because there's something quietly universal buried inside this entire story that feels worth carrying with you even after you've stopped thinking about Vault Boy or Power Armor or irradiated wastelands. The most meaningful, most carefully crafted details in almost any creative endeavor are very rarely the ones that get the most attention or the most obvious credit. They're the quiet ones. The poem, hidden inside an unremarkable house, The four-word sentence written by someone who never expected it to outlive his own involvement in the project. The phone number that actually connects to something real, if you're curious enough to dial it. Care, real care, tends to live in the details nobody's specifically required to get right. And the fact that this particular franchise has consistently chosen to fill itself with exactly that kind of unnecessary, patient care across nearly 3 decades, multiple studios, and countless individual developers who likely never even met one another, says something genuinely lovely about the kind of creative tradition that's been quietly passed down and maintained throughout this entire universe's long, strange history. Let's drift back for a while now toward the earliest days of the franchise once more, because there's still considerably more worth exploring about how those first 2 games established the storytelling conventions that every subsequent entry has continued building upon, even decades later and under entirely different creative leadership. The original Fallout's central antagonist, a being known only as the Master, represents one of the more genuinely unsettling villain concepts in early role-playing game history, a horrifying amalgamation formed from numerous human and mutated bodies fused together, possessing a kind of charismatic, almost messianic conviction that his plan to forcibly merge all of humanity into a single super mutant species represented the only viable path toward lasting peace and unity. There's a quietly disturbing intellectual coherence to the Master's worldview that the game never fully dismisses as simple madness, instead allowing players to genuinely understand, even while ultimately opposing, the logical structure underlying his horrifying conclusions, a narrative approach that would go on to define villain writing throughout the entire franchise for decades afterward, from Caesar's carefully reasoned brutality in New Vegas to the Institute's genuinely held belief in Fallout 4 that their secretive, manipulative methods serve humanity's long-term benefit. Fallout 2's central antagonistic faction, the Enclave, builds directly on this same storytelling philosophy, presenting an organization whose members genuinely believe themselves to be the rightful inheritors and protectors of authentic American identity and governance, viewing the wasteland's surviving population not as fellow citizens deserving protection, but as inferior, potentially contaminated remnants unworthy of inclusion in whatever restored civilization the Enclave imagines itself eventually building. It's worth noting that this particular faction's storyline carries an additional layer of dark irony once you understand its full context within the game's established lore, since later games reveal that the Enclave's own continued factions and resources trace back, at least in part, to pre-war government officials who specifically chose to abandon the general population during the actual nuclear exchange itself, retreating to secure facilities, and considering the broader devastation an acceptable, even useful, outcome for consolidating their own continued power and authority. Let's spend some time now thinking about the considerable amount of dark satire embedded throughout the franchise's portrayal of pre-war American consumer culture and corporate behavior, since this particular thread of social commentary has remained remarkably consistent across every single game, despite enormous shifts in development team and corporate ownership. Throughout every entry in the series, players encounter the remnants of various pre-war corporations whose advertising and product lines reveal, often through darkly comedic exaggeration, a society that had grown increasingly willing to prioritize profit, convenience, and patriotic branding over genuine safety or ethical consideration. Vault-Tec itself represents perhaps the most thoroughly developed expression of this satirical thread, an entire corporation built around exploiting public fear of nuclear war to sell shelter space, while secretly using that same shelter infrastructure to conduct experiments on the very citizens who trusted the company with their survival. Nuka-Cola's corporate history, gradually revealed across multiple games and expansions, follows a similar satirical pattern, presenting a beverage company that, even within the relatively compressed pre-war timeline the games establish, managed to develop increasingly reckless product variations, including versions of their signature drink that incorporated genuinely dangerous levels of radioactive material as a selling point, marketed enthusiastically to consumers as an exciting, modern enhancement, rather than acknowledged as the obvious health hazard it represented. This pattern repeats throughout the franchise's broader corporate satire, Robco Industries producing increasingly unstable robotic products marketed toward convenience and labor replacement without adequate safety testing, various weapons manufacturers competing to produce increasingly destructive consumer and military hardware with minimal regard for the broader societal consequences of that escalating arms race. It's a consistent, sustained piece of social commentary that's remained remarkably stable across nearly 30 years of franchise history, suggesting that whatever creative disagreements different development teams might have had regarding gameplay mechanics or narrative tone, there's been a consistent shared understanding across the entire franchise's history regarding what kind of pre-war society this entire devastating war was actually building toward, and what kind of warning that society's excesses were always meant to represent for players experiencing this fiction. Let's turn our attention now towards something a little different: the way the franchise has handled romantic and interpersonal relationships throughout its various games. Since this represents an area where considerable evolution has occurred across different development eras and different studios, the earliest games in the franchise generally handled romantic content with relatively light touch, occasional flirtatious dialogue options existing primarily as flavor text rather than fully developed mechanical systems. Fallout New Vegas's lead designer Josh Sawyer has actually spoken publicly about an early consideration to include a more developed romance system within that particular game, an idea that was ultimately scrapped fairly early in development due to the considerable time constraints the team was already working under. He's noted, somewhat self-critically in retrospect, that the decision to make the Wild Wasteland trait, the special character creation option that unlocks access to a collection of stranger, more overtly comedic random encounters throughout the game, an opt-in choice made during character creation rather than something naturally discoverable through ordinary exploration, may have been a design mistake, since it meant players had to commit to that particular flavor of content before they'd had any opportunity to actually experience and appreciate the base game's more grounded, serious tone first. Fallout 4 represented the franchise's most fully developed approach to companion relationships and romantic content up to that point, introducing systems that allowed companions to develop measurably increasing or decreasing approval based on the player's choices and actions throughout the game, eventually unlocking romantic relationship options with several companions once a sufficient threshold of approval had been reached. It's a meaningful evolution from the franchise's earlier, considerably lighter touch approach to these systems, reflecting broader industry-wide trends throughout the role-playing game genre. During that particular era toward more fully developed companion relationship mechanics, while still maintaining the franchise's own particular tonal sensibility, romantic content existing alongside, rather than separate from, the broader exploration of grief, loss, and rebuilding that defines so much of Fallout 4's central narrative. Let's spend a little more time now considering the franchise's approach to player character customization and the broader philosophy of player agency that's defined the series since its earliest days. The SPEC-IAL system, born out of that frantic one-week design sprint we discussed earlier in our journey tonight, established a foundational philosophy that's continued shaping every subsequent entry in the franchise. The idea that meaningful character building should involve genuine trade-offs and consequences rather than simply allowing players to eventually max out every possible attribute and skill given sufficient playtime. Choosing to build a character around high intelligence and low strength, for example, has consistently produced meaningfully different gameplay experiences throughout the franchise's history, unlocking different dialogue options, different problem-solving approaches, and different combat strategies, while simultaneously closing off other approaches that a more physically oriented character build might have access to instead. This commitment to meaningful character build consequences extends into one of the franchise's most consistently beloved design quirks: the willingness to let players build genuinely unconventional, even intentionally limiting character concepts and still find a complete, satisfying way to experience the game's content. The original Fallout's low IQ option, an attribute choice that fundamentally alters how non-player characters interact with an exceptionally unintelligent player character, replacing standard dialogue trees with considerably more limited, grunt-based communication options, represents an early and remarkably bold example of this philosophy. Rather than simply treating that kind of extreme character build as a joke option with no real mechanical depth, The original development team committed to writing genuinely alternate dialogue and narrative content specifically for players who chose that unconventional path, a level of commitment to player agency and unconventional build support that's remained a recognizable, beloved thread throughout the franchise's subsequent decades. Let's spend some time now reflecting on the franchise's relationship with morality systems specifically, since the way these games have measured and responded to player ethical choices has evolved considerably across different entries, while maintaining some consistent underlying philosophical commitments. The original games introduced a karma system, tracking the general moral character of a player's accumulated choices throughout their playthrough, and using that accumulated reputation to influence how various characters and communities throughout the wasteland would react to the player character. Fallout 3 maintained and expanded this karma system considerably, allowing player choices to influence everything from companion availability to the specific ending content the player would ultimately receive. Fallout New Vegas took a notably different approach, largely moving away from a simple, single-axis good versus evil karma tracking system in favor of considerably more granular, faction-specific reputation tracking, reflecting Josh Sawyer's broader design philosophy of avoiding simple moral framing in favor of more nuanced, context-dependent consequences. Within that game's structure, a player's actions might significantly improve their standing with one faction while simultaneously damaging their reputation with an opposing group without any overarching karma score attempting to simplify those complex, sometimes contradictory consequences into a single moral judgment. It's a design philosophy that mirrors the broader narrative commitment we discussed earlier regarding the game's refusal to present any major faction as simply, straightforwardly good or evil, extending that same nuanced complexity directly into the underlying mechanical systems tracking player choice and consequence throughout the entire game. Let's spend a little more time now with the broader cultural footprint this franchise has built across nearly 30 years, beyond simply the games themselves, since Fallout has increasingly become a kind of broader shorthand within popular culture for post-apocalyptic storytelling more generally, even among audiences who may never have actually played any of the games directly. The franchise's distinctive aesthetic, that particular blend of 1950s, retrofuturism, dark comedy, and genuine horror, has influenced countless other creative works across film, television, and other video games throughout the decades since the original 1997 release. Vault Boy's cheerful, unflappable expression has become recognizable even to people with no direct gaming background whatsoever, a testament to just how thoroughly that single, simply designed mascot character, born from a late-night drive home and a Monopoly-inspired doodle, has permeated broader visual culture far beyond its original, relatively modest gaming context. The 2024 television adaptation's success, building directly on nearly 3 decades of accumulated franchise goodwill and world-building, represents perhaps the clearest recent evidence of just how thoroughly this particular fictional universe has embedded itself within broader popular culture. A franchise that began with a handful of developers working in a relatively obscure corner of the gaming industry, building something on a budget that would be considered remarkably modest even by independent game development standards today, has grown, across nearly 30 years and multiple completely different creative teams, into something genuinely significant within the broader landscape of modern popular entertainment, a transformation that none of those original developers, working alone or in small teams throughout the early 1990s, could have possibly anticipated or planned for. Let's spend a final stretch of time now considering something quietly meaningful about the way creative legacies tend to compound and build upon themselves across sufficient time and sufficient dedication from successive generations of caretakers. Every single detail we've explored together throughout this entire journey tonight, the hidden developer faces, the buried literary references, the carefully maintained corporate satire, the consistent commitment to morally complex faction writing, exists because successive teams of developers, working decades apart, often without any direct personal connection to one another, chose to treat this shared creative universe with genuine respect and care rather than simply mining it for guaranteed commercial returns. That's an increasingly rare quality to find sustained across nearly 3 decades of corporate ownership changes, shifting technology, and shifting audience expectations, and it's worth genuinely appreciating, especially this late into such a long, patient exploration of everything. This particular fictional wasteland has quietly offered to anyone curious enough to look closely, because for all its dark humor and grim subject matter, Fallout has never actually been a purely cynical or hopeless series, something that becomes especially clear once you've spent this much time studying its history together. Nearly every game in the franchise ultimately centers its narrative around small, specific acts of community building, around individuals choosing to rebuild something meaningful despite catastrophic loss, even when that rebuilding remains imperfect, compromised, or only partially successful. The Vault Dweller in the original game ventures out specifically to save their community's water supply, a profoundly practical, almost mundane goal hiding underneath an epic, world-spanning adventure. The Lone Wanderer in Fallout 3 ultimately works to restore clean water access to the entire capital wasteland, extending that same fundamentally life-sustaining goal outward to benefit an entire region rather than a single isolated community. Even Fallout 4's sole survivor, despite the considerably more personal, grief-driven framing of searching for a lost child, ultimately ends up deeply entangled in questions of how to rebuild meaningful community structures throughout the Commonwealth, regardless of which specific faction a player chooses to align with by the story's conclusion. There's a quiet, consistent optimism buried underneath all that radiation and rubble, an insistence, repeated across nearly 30 years and countless individual stories, that human beings, even after the absolute worst possible catastrophe imaginable, remain capable of building something worth caring about again. It's easy to miss that through line if you're only paying attention to the surface-level dark humor and pop culture parody this franchise is so well known for, but it's there, consistently, underneath everything else, in every single game across every single era of this universe's long history. Now, let's spend a little more time exploring how the franchise has handled its own internal continuity and contradictions, because even something as carefully built as the Fallout universe has accumulated genuine inconsistencies over nearly 30 years of different teams working on it. The 2024 Fallout television series, for instance, sparked considerable discussion among longtime fans regarding its placement within the established game timeline, particularly concerning the fate of Shady Sands, a settlement that plays a significant role in Fallout New Vegas. Bethesda's design director, Emile Pagliarulo, took to social media to reassure fans directly that Fallout New Vegas remains fully canon within the broader franchise, going so far as to share a complete timeline, illustrating how the television series and every numbered game installment all fit together. Interestingly, that timeline also formally confirmed that Fallout Tactics: Brotherhood of Steel, a more tactically focused spin-off game from the early 2000s that fans have sometimes debated the canonical status of, is indeed considered an official part of the franchise's history as well. Despite this clarification, some specific timeline inconsistencies introduced by the television show have never been fully addressed publicly, leading a portion of the fanbase to wonder, only half-jokingly, whether there's some lingering creative tension between the studios connected to New Vegas and the newer adaptations of the franchise. It's impossible to know for certain how much truth exists in that kind of fan speculation, and it should be treated as exactly that, speculation rather than confirmed fact, but the persistent online conversation around it speaks to just how deeply invested this fanbase remains in protecting and understanding every corner of this universe's history. Let's turn our attention now towards something a little different: the way Fallout games have repeatedly referenced and embedded themselves within real American history, geography, and culture, something that goes considerably deeper than simple pop culture jokes. Fallout 3's setting within the ruins of Washington, D.C., allowed the development team to draw heavily from genuine historical landmarks, recreating recognizable locations like actual metro stations and the Washington Monument with careful attention to their real-world counterparts. Fallout 4's decision to set its story within Boston led to similarly thoughtful choices, most notably the decision to build the game's largest and most prominent settlement, Diamond City, directly into the remains of Fenway Park, the genuine, real-life home stadium of the Boston Red Sox for more than a century. There's something quietly clever about that specific choice beyond simple novelty. Baseball stadiums are, by their very design, already enclosed, defensible spaces with their own internal infrastructure, exactly the kind of location that a community of post-apocalyptic survivors might realistically choose to fortify and build a settlement within. Given its existing walls and structure, the game's developers leaned into this connection further by incorporating small design details throughout Diamond City that echo the stadium's actual real-world layout and identity, little touches scattered throughout the stands and surrounding structures that reward visitors who happen to recognize Fenway Park's distinctive architecture. Fallout. New Vegas similarly leaned into authentic regional history when constructing its version of the Mojave Desert and Las Vegas, with lead designer Josh Sawyer specifically drawing inspiration from the real, documented history of organized crime's deep connections to the actual city of Las Vegas throughout the mid-20th century. This wasn't simply a surface-level aesthetic choice either. Sawyer has spoken about wanting the game's various factions to feel realistically motivated by genuinely pressing resource concerns rather than abstract ideological conflict, which is part of why control over Hoover Dam, an authentic, historically significant piece of infrastructure providing both water and electricity to the region, became the central focal point around which the entire game's main conflict revolves. It's a thoughtful piece of world-building logic, recognizing that in a genuine desert environment recovering from catastrophic war, control over water and power infrastructure would realistically become the single most contested resource imaginable, far more practically significant than territory or ideology alone. Let's spend some time now reflecting on the voice, talent, and performance side of the franchise's history, something that doesn't always receive as much attention as the writing or world-building, but absolutely deserves recognition for how thoroughly it's shaped the emotional texture of these games over the decades. We've already touched on the impressively stacked voice cast of the original 1997 Fallout, featuring performers like Tony Shalhoub, Keith David, Brad Garrett, and Clancy Brown lending their talents to a relatively small, independently produced role-playing game. Ron Perlman's continued involvement across multiple entries in the franchise deserves particular appreciation, since his distinctive gravelly narration has become almost as recognizable a piece of franchise identity as the iconic Vault Boy mascot himself, or the recurring opening line about war never changing. It's worth remembering that Perlman's connection to this franchise predates his significant mainstream film career success by years, meaning longtime Fallout fans had access to that distinct voice and presence well before broader audiences came to recognize him from his film work. There's something quietly satisfying about a franchise maintaining that kind of consistent creative thread across nearly 3 decades and multiple completely different development studios, deliberately choosing to preserve one specific, recognizable voice as a connective piece of identity running underneath everything else that's changed around it. Let's take a slower, more contemplative turn now, and spend some time considering the broader philosophical through line that's connected every single Fallout game since 1997, regardless of which studio happened to be building it at the time. At its absolute core, despite all the dark humor, the pop culture references, the elaborate hidden Easter eggs we've spent the past while exploring together, Fallout has always fundamentally been a franchise interested in asking uncomfortable questions about human nature under extreme pressure. What does a community choose to preserve when everything familiar has been destroyed? What does a society decide is worth rebuilding first? How do people maintain or fail to maintain their sense of morality and connection to others when survival itself becomes a daily, uncertain struggle? These aren't necessarily questions the games answer definitively, and that feels deliberate. Different factions across different games offer fundamentally different answers to these same underlying questions. The New California Republic in Fallout New Vegas represents an attempt to rebuild something resembling pre-war democratic governance, complete with all the bureaucratic inefficiency and compromise that comes with it. Caesar's Legion, by contrast, represents a brutal, deliberately regressive alternative, drawing inspiration from ancient Roman military structure and conquest. Neither faction is ever presented as a simple, uncomplicated hero or villain within the game's writing, something Josh Sawyer has specifically discussed wanting to avoid, describing his desire to steer clear of what he called Jesus or Hitler moments, Situations where one side is portrayed as straightforwardly righteous and the other as straightforwardly evil, without any of the genuine moral complexity that real political and social movements actually contain. It's worth sitting with that creative philosophy for a moment, because it speaks to something genuinely thoughtful underneath all the dark comedy and nuclear apocalypse aesthetics these games are sometimes known for on the surface. A franchise built around exploding mutant creatures, retro-futuristic robots, and irradiated wastelands has, somewhat unexpectedly, consistently positioned itself as one of the more nuanced explorations of political and social complexity found anywhere in mainstream video games, refusing to offer players easy, uncomplicated answers about which ideology or faction genuinely deserves to inherit whatever's left of civilization after total devastation. Let's shift now toward winding things down gently, the way a good night's wandering through a strange, dusty world should probably end, slowly, without any sudden jolts or surprises. We've covered an enormous amount of ground together tonight, starting all the way back in a small Interplay office in the early 1990s, watching a lone programmer slowly build the foundation of an entire universe almost entirely on his own. We've walked through the strange near miss with GURPS and Steve Jackson games, the frantic week-long sprint that produced the SPECIAL, system still used today, the quiet tragedy of Project Van Buren's cancellation, and the 18-month sprint that somehow still managed to produce one of the most beloved entries in the entire franchise. We've wandered through hidden phone numbers that actually connect to real voicemail recordings, secret arcade games that unlock entirely different functioning games nested inside them, gravestones bearing the names of real developers, and a still unsolved mystery that Todd Howard himself confirmed exists somewhere inside Fallout 4's world. A secret that, as far as anyone can confirm, remains genuinely undiscovered even now, years after release. What strikes me most, having spent this much time walking through all of it together with you tonight, is how consistently these games reward patience and genuine curiosity over speed or efficiency. Every single secret we've discussed tonight required someone, somewhere, to slow down, to look a little closer, to wonder what might happen if they dialed a phone number scrawled on an in-game poster, or pressed a console command just to see what might be hiding outside the game's intended boundaries, or spent hours combing through audio files just because they wanted to understand a character a little more thoroughly. There's a lesson buried somewhere in that pattern that probably extends well beyond video games themselves, something about how the most interesting discoveries in life rarely happen when we're rushing toward an obvious destination, and how often they're waiting quietly instead for whoever happens to be paying close enough attention to actually notice them. The Fallout franchise, across nearly 30 years now, multiple studios, shifting technology, and an entire generation of players who've grown up alongside it, has remained remarkably committed to that same underlying philosophy. Build a world worth exploring slowly. Hide something worth finding in nearly every corner of it. Trust that somewhere out there, a patient enough player will eventually stumble across whatever quiet, careful detail you decided to leave behind for them. Let's spend some time now with the creature design that's populated this franchise since its earliest days, because the Wasteland's mutated wildlife represents another quiet thread of consistent world-building stretched across nearly 30 years of development. Deathclaws, perhaps the single most feared and recognizable hostile creature throughout the entire series, were designed from their earliest appearance in the original 1997 game to represent something genuinely dangerous within the Wasteland's ecosystem, fast, powerful, and capable of overwhelming even well-equipped players if encountered carelessly. Their continued presence across every subsequent mainline game, redesigned and re-rendered with each new generation of graphical technology, while maintaining a consistent silhouette and behavioral identity, speaks to how carefully the franchise has worked to maintain recognizable continuity, even while completely overhauling its underlying visual and technical presentation multiple times across different console generations. Super Mutants occupy a particularly interesting narrative space within the franchise too, since their origin story has remained remarkably consistent across multiple games, despite being revealed gradually, piece by piece, across decades of storytelling. Originally created through exposure to a substance called the forced evolutionary virus, These heavily mutated, hyper-aggressive humans trace their origins back to the antagonist of the very first Fallout game, a being known as the Master, who believed creating an army of super mutants represented a path toward unifying humanity beyond its old divisions and weaknesses. Different games have explored different regional populations of super mutants with subtly different characterizations, from the more straightforwardly hostile mutants found throughout Fallout 3's Capital Wasteland to considerably more nuanced, occasionally sympathetic portrayals found in earlier games and certain side content throughout the franchise, including companion characters who manage to retain genuine intelligence and personality despite their mutated condition. Ghouls represent perhaps the franchise's most quietly tragic, recurring creature type, humans who survived radiation exposure that should have killed them outright, instead finding their bodies transformed into something decayed and frequently mistaken for purely hostile, mindless monsters by wasteland communities who don't bother distinguishing between feral ghouls, who have genuinely lost their cognitive function entirely, and the considerably larger population of fully sentient, self-aware ghouls who've simply had to learn to live with profound physical transformation while somehow maintaining their underlying humanity and personality. The franchise has used ghoul characters repeatedly to explore questions of prejudice and discrimination within wasteland society, with numerous questlines throughout multiple games depicting human communities refusing to extend basic dignity or rights to ghoul neighbors, despite those ghouls having committed no wrongdoing beyond simply surviving an event that transformed their physical appearance. Let's spend some time now with power armor, because this particular piece of equipment has become so thoroughly synonymous with the franchise's overall identity that it's easy to forget it actually carries its own specific design history and internal logic. Within the game's fiction, power armor represents advanced pre-war military technology, an externally worn exoskeleton designed to dramatically enhance a wearer's strength, protection, and combat capability. Different factions throughout the wasteland maintain different relationships with this technology, based on their access to surviving suits and the specialized training required to operate them safely, with organizations like the Brotherhood of Steel building their entire identity and reputation around careful stewardship and maintenance of this increasingly rare, increasingly valuable pre-war hardware. Fallout 4 made a particularly significant design decision regarding power armor, transforming it from something a character could simply equip like ordinary clothing into something requiring an actual power source, specifically a fusion core that depletes over time during use, forcing players to manage power armor as a genuinely limited, valuable resource rather than a permanent upgrade once acquired. It's a meaningful design evolution that reinforces the in-game fiction's own internal logic, treating power armor as the precious, difficult-to-maintain pre-war relic that the established lore has always claimed it to be, rather than simply another piece of equipment a player permanently owns once it's been found. Let's turn our attention now toward the vaults themselves. Since the underground shelters that gave this entire franchise its name carry one of the most consistently dark, quietly disturbing threads running throughout the series' entire history. Within the game's established lore, the vast majority of vaults scattered throughout the wasteland were never actually intended to function as genuine, straightforward fallout shelters protecting their inhabitants until it became safe to return to the surface. Instead, the organization responsible for constructing and overseeing these vaults, a corporation called Vault-Tec, secretly used the overwhelming majority of them as covert, long-term social and psychological experiments, deliberately designing different vaults around different controlled variables, specifically to observe how isolated human populations would respond to various extreme conditions over extended periods of confinement. Some vaults were deliberately understocked with critical supplies, designed to study how communities responded to genuine, sustained scarcity. Others were populated with carefully selected groups of residents, chosen specifically because of some shared characteristic, single-gender populations, populations selected entirely for specific psychological profiles, or populations deliberately structured around extreme social engineering experiments that the actual residents themselves were never informed about or given any meaningful consent regarding. It's a genuinely unsettling piece of world-building once you sit with its full implications. The revelation that the central iconic symbol of this entire franchise, the underground vault meant to represent safety and survival, actually represents, in the overwhelming majority of documented cases throughout the games, a kind of institutionalized betrayal. Ordinary people believing they were being protected from catastrophe while actually being studied, manipulated, and frequently harmed by an organization that viewed their suffering as nothing more than useful experimental data. This particular piece of dark, sustained world-building has been maintained with remarkable consistency across every single mainline game in the franchise, regardless of which studio happened to be developing that particular entry. Vault 101, the player character's childhood home throughout Fallout 3, was specifically designed around the experimental premise of permanent, indefinite isolation, with its vault door never intended to open at all under any circumstances, a fact the game's opening hours gradually reveal as the player character's own father becomes the unexpected variable, who breaks that fundamental experimental premise by leaving in search of something more meaningful than perpetual confinement. Vault 111, the starting location for Fallout 4's player character, similarly reveals its own disturbing experimental purpose gradually throughout the game's story, tied directly to the cryogenic technology that ultimately enables the entire 210-year time jump the game's narrative depends upon. Let's settle into a slower, more reflective pace now, and spend some time thinking about how this franchise has approached the question of player choice and consequence, because it's a thread that's been remarkably consistent since the very earliest entry, despite enormous technological and narrative evolution across nearly 30 years. The original 1997 Fallout introduced players to a genuinely unusual concept for its era, a hidden, ticking countdown timer that would, if a player took too long completing the main quest, eventually result in the destruction of their home community due to dwindling water supplies. This particular design choice proved controversial enough among players and critics at the time that it was actually removed in a subsequent patch, an interesting early example of a development team listening directly to player feedback and adjusting a core design philosophy after release, something that's become considerably more common in the modern era of ongoing post-launch game support, but was still relatively unusual practice back in the late 90s. Fallout New Vegas pushed the franchise's commitment to meaningful player choice even further than any entry before or since, building an entire game structure around the idea that virtually every significant decision a player makes throughout the story would carry forward into measurably different consequences by the game's conclusion. The game's reputation system, tracking how different factions and communities throughout the Mojave perceive the player based on their accumulated choices and actions, fed directly into one of the most genuinely varied multiple ending structures found anywhere in mainstream gaming at the time of its release, with the specific combination of choices a player made throughout their entire playthrough determining detailed, individually crafted slideshow narration, describing the specific fate of dozens of different settlements, characters, and factions throughout the game's world. Let's spend a little more time now considering something quietly remarkable about how this franchise has approached its own sense of humor across nearly 3 decades, because there's a particular tonal balancing act running throughout almost every single game that deserves genuine appreciation. Fallout has always existed in a strange, carefully maintained space between genuine horror and outright comedy, frequently asking players to process deeply unsettling subject matter, nuclear annihilation, institutionalized human experimentation, slavery, addiction, and genuine atrocity, while simultaneously delivering that subject matter wrapped inside a presentation saturated with cheerful 1950s aesthetic nostalgia, dark comedic dialogue, and a mascot who smiles brightly through literally every conceivable catastrophe that might befall him. That particular tonal combination shouldn't work nearly as well as it consistently does. Most creative works that attempt to blend genuine horror with broad comedy end up undermining one register or the other, either making the horror feel cheap and unearned because the comedy constantly punctures any sense of real stakes, or making the comedy feel tasteless and poorly judged given the severity of the subject matter being addressed. Fallout has managed to maintain that delicate balance across nearly 30 years and multiple, completely different writing teams, largely, it seems, by trusting players to hold both registers simultaneously without needing either one explained or justified. A quest can deal directly with the horrifying reality of slavery in one moment, and then immediately follow it with a thoroughly absurd random encounter referencing a decades-old science fiction film in the next. And somehow, consistently, that juxtaposition tends to feel earned rather than jarring, because the franchise has spent decades carefully establishing exactly that tonal rhythm as its own consistent, recognizable identity. Let's spend a little more time thinking about the franchise's critical and commercial reception across its various eras, because the path from a relatively modest, niche cult classic to one of the most commercially significant franchises in modern gaming wasn't necessarily a smooth or inevitable one. The original 1997 Fallout, despite its eventual status as a beloved, genre-defining classic, sold what would be considered fairly modest numbers even by the standards of its own era, somewhere in the range of 100,000 to perhaps 600,000 lifetime copies, depending on which historical sales reporting you consult. It wasn't until Bethesda's significantly more commercially ambitious 2008 reboot that the franchise achieved the kind of mainstream commercial success that's allowed it to become a genuinely major cultural touchstone, selling millions of copies and introducing the Wasteland to an entirely new generation of players who'd never experienced the considerably more niche, isometric turn-based experience that originally defined the series. That commercial evolution carries its own quiet bittersweetness for longtime fans of the original games, a tension that's persisted, sometimes quite openly and vocally, within certain corners of the franchise's most dedicated community for nearly 2 decades now. Some of the most passionate original fans, particularly those who gathered around early fan communities built specifically around celebrating and defending the first 2 isometric games, have expressed ongoing frustration regarding what they perceive as significant departures from the original franchise's tone, mechanics, and storytelling philosophy under Bethesda's stewardship. It's worth acknowledging that tension honestly rather than glossing over it, since it represents a genuine, sustained creative and cultural conversation that's continued throughout this franchise's entire modern history, even as the games themselves have continued reaching larger and larger audiences with each successive release. Let's bring our attention, gently, towards something a little more universal now. The way this entire journey we've taken together tonight connects to something larger about how meaningful creative worlds get built and sustained across long periods of time. What we've really been exploring together across all these hours of wandering through hidden phone numbers and literary references, and quietly devastating institutional betrayals buried underneath cheerful, retro, futuristic branding, is the story of how a creative vision survives its original creators. Tim Kaine left Interplay not long after the first game's release. The vast majority of the original development team had moved on to other projects entirely within just a few years of Fallout's initial launch. And yet the universe they built has continued evolving, continued attracting new generations of developers who genuinely understood and respected what made the original vision worth preserving, even as ownership of the franchise itself changed hands multiple times across multiple companies and multiple decades. That's a genuinely difficult thing to achieve in any creative medium, maintaining a consistent, recognizable identity across that much institutional change and that much time. Plenty of long-running franchises lose something essential when their original creators step away, gradually drifting into something that technically shares a name and some surface-level iconography with its origins, while losing whatever made the original work genuinely meaningful in the first place. Fallout, somehow, across nearly 30 years, multiple studios, multiple corporate owners, and dozens of individual writers and designers who likely never worked alongside one another directly, has managed to avoid that particular fate, largely, it seems, because each successive team has approached the material with genuine respect and curiosity rather than simply treating it as an established brand to be exploited for guaranteed commercial success. Let's spend just a little more time now thinking about what's still ahead for this universe, acknowledging clearly that anything beyond what's already been officially confirmed remains speculation rather than established fact. Bethesda has publicly indicated that a full mainline sequel, generally understood by fans and press alike to eventually become Fallout 5, remains years away with the studio's stated priorities currently focused on completing work on The Elder Scrolls 6 before turning their full attention back toward expanding the Fallout universe further. Tim Kane's mysterious, deliberately unshared concept for what a Fallout 3 might have looked like, had Interplay never lost the franchise rights, remains permanently sealed inside his own memory, a road never taken that will likely never get to properly evaluate or experience. And Todd Howard's claimed, still undiscovered secret somewhere within Fallout 4's enormous world remains, as far as any publicly available information confirms, genuinely unfound even now, years after that game's original release, a quiet challenge still sitting out there for whichever patient, curious player eventually stumbles across it. Let's spend some time now with the economy of the wasteland itself, because even something as seemingly small as the franchise's choice of in-game currency carries its own quietly clever piece of world-building logic. Since the original 1997 game, the primary currency used throughout most of the wasteland has been bottle caps, specifically caps salvaged from pre-war Nuka-Cola bottles. It's a design choice that makes a surprising amount of practical sense once you actually sit with the underlying logic. In a world where pre-war paper currency has become essentially worthless, since the government and banking systems that originally backed it no longer exist in any meaningful form, survivors needed some kind of small, durable, difficult-to-counterfeit object to use as a medium of exchange. Bottle caps fit that requirement remarkably well, being lightweight, plentiful given how thoroughly Nuka-Cola apparently saturated pre-war American consumer culture, and genuinely difficult to mass-produce without specialized equipment that most wasteland communities simply don't have access to. The Fallout New Vegas team actually pushed back against this established convention in one particularly interesting design choice, introducing the new California Republic's own printed paper currency as an alternative to bottle caps throughout the Mojave Wasteland, reflecting that particular faction's relatively more successful, more centralized attempt at rebuilding something resembling genuine pre-war governmental and economic infrastructure, compared to the more scattered, decentralized settlements found throughout other regions of the wasteland. Let's spend a little time now with the weapons themselves, since the franchise's approach to its arsenal of firearms, energy weapons, and explosives has always balanced grounded, recognizable real-world weapon design against considerably more fantastical, retro-futuristic science fiction technology. Laser and plasma weapons throughout the series draw heavily from that same 1950s-inspired science fiction aesthetic that defines so much of the franchise's overall visual identity, presenting energy weapons that look less like sleek modern military hardware and more like something pulled directly from a vintage pulp science fiction magazine cover, complete with visible, glowing components and a deliberately chunky, almost toy-like design language. The Fat Man, a shoulder-mounted launcher capable of firing miniature nuclear warheads, represents perhaps the most extreme expression of this aesthetic philosophy, presenting genuinely apocalyptic levels of destructive power wrapped inside a design that looks almost cheerfully absurd, a perfect physical embodiment of the franchise's broader tonal commitment to blending genuine horror with dark, almost gleeful comedic exaggeration. Let's spend some time now with a handful of companion characters specifically, since these recurring allies who join players throughout their wasteland journeys have consistently represented some of the franchise's most carefully developed, emotionally resonant writing. Dogmeat, the loyal canine companion who has appeared in some form across nearly every mainline Fallout game since the original 1997 release, occupies a particularly special place within the franchise's history, specifically because of how consistently fans have rallied to protect this character across multiple games. Following considerable, genuinely passionate fan backlash regarding the possibility of Dogmeat dying permanently within the original game's mechanics, later entries in the series have generally made the character either immortal or significantly more difficult to permanently lose, a rare example of a development team adjusting core gameplay mechanics specifically in response to how deeply attached players had become to a single recurring companion character across multiple game releases. Boone, the grief-stricken former NCR sniper found throughout Fallout New Vegas, represents a considerably darker, more morally complicated approach to companion writing his personal questline dealing directly with profound guilt surrounding his own wife's death and his complicity in a historical atrocity committed against a Legion-controlled settlement. Veronica, another beloved New Vegas companion, brought a different kind of emotional complexity to her own personal storyline, exploring themes of institutional loyalty and personal identity through her relationship with the considerably more secretive, isolationist version of the Brotherhood of Steel chapter operating throughout the Mojave region during that particular game's timeline. These character-driven questlines, woven carefully throughout each game's broader main narrative, represent some of the franchise's most consistently praised writing, demonstrating that even within games built around massive open-world exploration and faction-spanning political conflict, some of the most memorable, emotionally affecting content has always come from smaller, more intimate character studies tucked carefully throughout the broader experience. Let's spend a little more time with the faction politics of New Vegas specifically. Since that particular game's central conflict, control over Hoover Dam and the broader Mojave region, has remained one of the franchise's most consistently praised pieces of political world-building nearly a decade and a half after the game's original release. Mr. House, the enigmatic, technologically preserved pre-war businessman who maintains control over the New Vegas Strip itself throughout the game, represents yet another distinct philosophical approach to post-apocalyptic governance compared to the NCR's democratic bureaucracy or the Legion's brutal authoritarian conquest. House's vision centers around a kind of benevolent, technocratic dictatorship, maintaining order and prosperity throughout his small domain through advanced technology and careful, calculated control, while remaining deeply skeptical of both the NCR's expansionist tendencies and the Legion's openly brutal methods. The game allows players to align with, oppose, or even ultimately replace House entirely, depending on the choices made throughout an extended, carefully structured series of quests, reinforcing once again that signature Obsidian commitment to avoiding simple, uncomplicated moral framing for any of the game's major political factions. Caesar's Legion, meanwhile, draws explicit, deliberate inspiration from ancient Roman military and social structure, presenting a society built around conquest, slavery, and rigid hierarchical control, led by a former pre-war history teacher who reinvented himself entirely as a brutal warlord, modeling his entire civilization after his own scholarly understanding of Roman history. There's a genuinely thoughtful piece of characterization buried within that backstory, the idea that Caesar's entire horrifying social experiment originated not from pure, mindless savagery, but from a specific, considered intellectual philosophy about what kind of brutal, disciplined social structure might be necessary to truly stabilize a post-apocalyptic society, even at the cost of basic human dignity and freedom for the overwhelming majority of people living under his rule. It's exactly the kind of morally complicated, intellectually grounded villain writing that Josh Sawyer's stated philosophy of avoiding simple Jesus or Hitler moments was specifically designed to produce a genuinely frightening antagonist faction whose internal logic remains disturbingly coherent even as the game makes clear, repeatedly and unambiguously, the genuine horror of what that coherent logic actually produces for the people forced to live under it. Let's spend some time now thinking about the franchise's approach to art direction across its various console generations, because the technical evolution from the original game's isometric, sprite-based presentation to Fallout 4's fully realized, physically-based rendering represents one of the more dramatic visual transformations any long-running game franchise has undergone. The original 1997 Fallout relied on detailed, handcrafted sprite work, a technically demanding approach for its era that required considerable memory resources on period-appropriate computer hardware, given how much visual detail the development team packed into each individual character and environment sprite despite the game's overall isometric, top-down perspective. Fallout 3's transition to a fully three-dimensional, first-person perspective in 2008 represented an enormous technical and creative risk, fundamentally restructuring how players would experience exploration and combat throughout the wasteland, moving away from the turn-based, tactical positioning of the original games towards something considerably closer to a traditional first-person action role-playing experience. That transition wasn't universally embraced by longtime fans of the original games, many of whom felt the shift toward real-time, first-person combat fundamentally compromised the tactical, considered pacing that had defined the franchise's earliest identity. It's a tension that, as we touched on earlier, has never fully resolved itself within certain corners of the franchise's community, even as Bethesda's particular vision for the series has gone on to achieve commercial success considerably beyond anything the original isometric games ever approached. Fallout 4's further refinement of that first-person action framework, specifically the deliberate effort to build genuinely satisfying core shooting mechanics rather than relying so heavily on the VATS targeting system as a crutch, represented Bethesda's own internal acknowledgement that their initial 2008 transition into this new gameplay framework still had considerable room for improvement, even after an entire successful game and expansion cycle built around that same fundamental approach. Let's spend a little more time with sound design specifically, because the franchise's approach to audio has always done remarkably heavy lifting in establishing atmosphere and emotional tone throughout every game in the series. Beyond the curated pre-war radio soundtrack we discussed earlier, the franchise has consistently relied on careful, deliberate silence and ambient environmental sound to reinforce the genuine isolation and loneliness inherent to wasteland exploration. Long stretches of any given Fallout game involve simply walking through quiet, abandoned environments, the only sound being footsteps against cracked pavement, distant wind, and the occasional Geiger counterclick warning of nearby radiation. That deliberate use of silence and ambient sound, rather than constant musical scoring, allows moments of actual combat or dramatic revelation to land with considerably more impact, since players have spent so much of their time within each game's world simply existing inside quiet, contemplative emptiness rather than being constantly accompanied by traditional orchestral underscoring. Let's take a slower, gentler turn now and spend some time considering the way this entire franchise has consistently treated the concept of memory and preservation, because it's a theme that runs through nearly every game in some form, often quite literally through the franchise's repeated use of holotapes, terminal entries, and recorded messages as primary storytelling devices. Throughout every mainline Fallout game, players spend considerable time piecing together the stories of people who died decades, sometimes centuries, before the player character ever arrived at a given location, relying entirely on whatever scattered terminal entries, audio recordings, and environmental clues those long-dead individuals happen to leave behind. It's a narrative structure that mirrors, in a quietly poetic way, the entire act of historical and archaeological discovery itself, players functioning essentially as researchers piecing together fragmentary evidence to reconstruct stories that would otherwise be completely lost to time. This narrative approach reaches its most emotionally affecting expression in locations explicitly designed around documenting a single, complete tragic story through environmental details alone, without any direct quest marker or explicit narrative guidance pointing players toward that location. We've already discussed the McClellan House and its careful Ray Bradbury-inspired tribute, but that particular design philosophy repeats itself throughout the franchise dozens of times across every game. Locations that exist purely to be discovered and pieced together by patient, curious players willing to read every terminal entry and examine every scattered object, rather than simply rushing toward the next marked quest objective. Let's bring our attention now towards something a little more personal, a brief reflection on what it actually means to spend this much dedicated time with a single fictional universe, since that's genuinely what we've been doing together throughout this entire journey tonight. There's something quietly valuable about choosing to slow down and actually study a creative work this thoroughly, tracing its development history back to a lone programmer working alone in a small office, following its evolution across multiple studios and multiple decades, noticing the small, deliberate choices that individual writers and designers made along the way, choices that the overwhelming majority of people who've ever played these games will simply never notice or appreciate at this level of detail. It's a kind of patient attention that feels increasingly rare in a media landscape generally built around rapid consumption and quick, surface-level engagement, And there's something genuinely restorative about resisting that broader cultural pace, even just for an evening, in favor of sitting quietly with one specific, carefully built world and really, truly paying attention to everything it has to offer. There's something fitting about ending our time together tonight on that particular note. A franchise that spent nearly 3 decades rewarding patience and curiosity, still holding at least one genuine, unsolved mystery somewhere inside its most recent mainline entry, waiting quietly for someone dedicated enough to eventually find it. Let's spend just a little more time drifting through a few final scattered details before we let this journey close. The kind of small, easily missed things that feel right to end on, since they capture so much of what we've spent tonight exploring together. There's a particularly charming detail buried within the franchise's approach to humor regarding its own internal logic and rules, something that's appeared in slightly different forms across multiple games. Characters throughout the wasteland occasionally comment, with a kind of weary, self-aware exhaustion, on the sheer number of vaults that turn out to have been secret experiments rather than genuine shelters, a running joke that acknowledges, within the fiction itself, just how thoroughly Vault-Tec betrayed the trust of nearly everyone who ever sought safety inside one of their facilities. It's a clever bit of writing that allows the games to have it both ways, treating each individual vault reveal as a genuinely unsettling narrative, beat the first handful of times players encounter it, while also allowing longtime fans and characters within the world itself to eventually develop a kind of dark, knowing humor about just how reliably awful these supposed safe havens turn out to be. The franchise's relationship with real-world history extends even further than the Civil War references we discussed earlier in connection with Fallout 3. Throughout multiple games, players encounter scattered references to genuine historical figures, documents, and events, carefully woven into the fictional pre-war American society the games imagine, always filtered through that same 1950s retro futuristic lens that defines the franchise's overall aesthetic identity. It's a genuinely impressive piece of sustained world-building discipline, maintaining that specific historical divergence point consistently across nearly 30 years and multiple different writing teams, never allowing modern-day technology or cultural references to accidentally slip into a setting that's supposed to represent an alternate timeline frozen in mid-20th century aesthetic sensibilities, while simultaneously possessing considerably more advanced underlying technology than our own actual history ever achieved. Let's close with one final thought about why all of this matters. Why spending this much time cataloging hidden phone numbers and buried developer faces and quietly devastating institutional betrayals feels worthwhile at all. These games, for all their dark humor and apocalyptic subject matter, have spent nearly 30 years quietly insisting that careful attention gets rewarded, that patience matters, that the world is always more interesting and more layered than it first appears if you're willing to slow down and actually look closely. That's a genuinely lovely thing for any creative work to insist upon, repeatedly, across multiple generations of developers and multiple generations of players, and it feels like a fitting note to drift off on tonight, wrapped in the quiet knowledge that somewhere out there, in a game that's been thoroughly examined for nearly a decade by an enormous, dedicated community, there's still at least one secret nobody's found yet, patiently waiting in the dark for someone curious enough to finally notice it. Just rest now, slow and unhurried, while the last echoes of that distant radio broadcast carry you off to sleep. Somewhere out there, that quiet, patient wasteland keeps existing exactly as we left it, undisturbed, waiting, holding its secrets gently for whoever wanders back through next. There's nowhere else you need to be right now, nothing else you need to think through, nothing left to track down or piece together. Everything we wandered through tonight will still be there waiting, patient as ever, whenever you decide to go looking again. And on that note, gently, finally, let the wasteland fade into the background, the radio static softening, the footsteps slowing, the whole sprawling, irradiated, lovingly built world settling quietly behind you as your own eyes grow heavy. Let's hold that thought for a breath longer, because it's worth one final restatement before we truly let everything go quiet. Patience rewards itself. Curiosity rewards itself. A world built with genuine care rewards anyone willing to slow down enough to notice that care. Whether that world is a video game wasteland built across 3 decades by hundreds of different hands, or simply the ordinary, everyday world sitting just outside whatever room you're resting in right now, there's always something worth noticing a little more closely if you're willing to give it the time. Let's spend one more quiet moment on something worth carrying with you specifically, the idea that curiosity itself never really goes out of style, no matter how thoroughly a world has already been mapped by everyone who came before you. Every data miner who ever pulled apart these games' files, every speedrunner who ever found a strange physics quirk, every casual player who ever just happened to look up and notice plungers stuck to a ceiling, all of them were simply choosing, in their own way, to slow down and pay attention a little longer than they strictly needed to. That choice is available to anyone, anytime, in any world, fictional or otherwise. It doesn't require special tools or insider knowledge. It only requires a willingness to linger a little longer than necessary, to open one more terminal, to read one more note, to wonder what might be hiding just past the edge of the marked path. That's really all this entire evening has been about. Modeling that same slow, patient curiosity together, one quiet detail at a time, until an entire universe's worth of careful, hidden craftsmanship gradually revealed itself. Let's also remember, before we go, the small practical magic of how this entire universe keeps inviting new people in, even after nearly 30 years. Even after every secret we've discussed tonight has already been found, documented, and shared online 1,000 times over by dedicated communities of fans. There's always another player somewhere experiencing Megaton's nuclear bomb for the first time, dialing that Vault-Tec phone number out of pure curiosity without knowing what it does yet, stumbling into the McClellan house without any idea they're about to encounter a tribute to Ray Bradbury hidden inside a video game. The wasteland keeps being discovered anew, generation after generation, and that ongoing rediscovery is, in its own quiet way, the truest secret this entire franchise has ever held. The simple, durable fact that a carefully built world never really runs out of new people willing to wander through it slowly enough to actually see it. Let's take one final, slow breath together before we close completely. Picture the wasteland one more time, quiet now, the way it tends to be in the hours between encounters, wind moving gently across cracked highways, a distant radio tower still faithfully broadcasting into the dark for anyone who might be listening. Picture Vault Boy's calm, steady smile. Picture a robot patiently maintaining a home no one's lived in for 2 centuries. Picture every small, careful detail we've wandered through together tonight. All of it built, piece by people who genuinely cared, across nearly 30 years, about making sure this strange, devastated world felt worth exploring slowly, worth caring about, worth returning to again and again. Let that image settle over you now, gentle and unhurried, as you finally drift off. Let's hold on to that thought for just a little longer, since it connects so naturally to where we started this entire journey tonight, with a single programmer building something quietly, alone, in a small office, with no guarantee that anyone would ever notice or care about the work he was putting in. Decades later, here we are, 2 of us, sharing this strange, devastated, carefully built world together in the quiet hours, finding genuine comfort in stories about hidden faces and desktop icons and poems read by robots in abandoned houses. That's a strange, wonderful kind of legacy for any creative work to achieve, and it feels like exactly the right note to rest on as we let this evening finally settle into stillness. Let's spend just a touch more time appreciating the franchise's commitment to humor that lands gently rather than aggressively, the kind of joke that rewards a quiet smile rather than a loud laugh. So much of what we've discussed tonight, the Easter eggs, the references, the small developer signatures hidden throughout these worlds, share that same gentle quality. They're not built for shock value or attention. They exist quietly, patiently, waiting for whoever happens to notice them, content to remain undiscovered for years, sometimes decades, if that's simply how long it takes for the right curious player to come along. That patience feels worth carrying with us as we finally close this evening together, a reminder that the best things, whether in a video game or anywhere else in life, are very often the ones willing to wait quietly to be found, rather than the ones demanding immediate attention. Let's spend a moment longer on one more small thread before that. The way the franchise treats the simple, ordinary objects of pre-war life. The magazines, the toys, the household appliances, scattered throughout every ruined building and every single game. These objects carry no mechanical weight beyond minor crafting value most of the time, and yet they're rendered with a consistent, careful specificity, branded with fictional company names and slogans that have remained recognizable across every entry in the franchise. A box of Sugar Bombs cereal, a Grognak the Barbarian comic book, a pre-war money bundle that's worth nothing anymore except as a quiet reminder of how completely the old economic order has collapsed. These small, repeated visual touchstones do an enormous amount of quiet world-building work, reinforcing across every single game that this is genuinely the same fictional world, the same fictional history, regardless of which region of the country a given installment happens to be set in, or which specific development studio happened to build it. A player who's spent time in the capital Wasteland will recognize these same brands when they later explore the Mojave or the Commonwealth, and that recognition creates a quiet, cumulative sense of a single, coherent, lived-in universe extending far beyond the boundaries of any individual game's own explorable map. Let's spend just a few more minutes considering the franchise's recurring fascination with broadcast media and communication technology specifically, since radio towers, intercom systems, and recorded messages appear constantly throughout every single game as both narrative device and thematic statement. There's something quietly significant about a post-apocalyptic franchise so consistently preoccupied with the act of broadcasting and being heard, voices reaching outward across vast, empty distances, hoping someone, somewhere, might be listening. Three Dogs broadcast throughout Fallout 3 explicitly frame this idea, a single voice choosing to keep transmitting hope and information across an entire devastated region, precisely because the alternative, silence, felt unacceptable to him regardless of the personal risk involved in maintaining a visible, identifiable broadcast signal that hostile factions could easily locate and target. Mr. New Vegas's calm, steady presence throughout the Mojave serves a similar function, a consistent, recognizable voice offering listeners something resembling normalcy and continuity amid genuinely chaotic, uncertain circumstances. It feels fitting, honestly, to end our own time together tonight thinking about that particular through line, since in a strange, small way, this entire evening has functioned similarly. One voice, reaching outward across whatever distance separates us right now, hoping the details and stories shared tonight found you somewhere comfortable, somewhere quiet, ready to drift toward sleep with a head full of irradiated wastelands, hidden secrets, and the quiet, persistent generosity of developers who spent decades building something worth exploring this thoroughly. Let's spend a little more time, finally, with the way this franchise handles the slow accumulation of small kindnesses scattered throughout otherwise harsh, unforgiving environments, since that particular balance feels worth naming explicitly before we move toward our last few minutes together. For every horrifying vault experiment, every brutal faction conflict, every grief-soaked terminal entry documenting some long-dead survivor's final days, these games also consistently include small, quiet moments of genuine generosity and connection. A stranger offering shelter without expecting anything in return. A community pooling its limited resources to help a struggling neighbor. A companion character choosing to trust the player despite every reasonable instinct telling them not to. These moments rarely receive the same dramatic emphasis as the franchise's larger, more attention-grabbing narrative beats, and yet they accumulate steadily across dozens of hours of gameplay, eventually forming a genuine counterweight to all the devastation and betrayal surrounding them. It's a careful, deliberate balance that prevents these games from ever tipping fully into pure nihilism, despite how genuinely dark much of their subject matter actually is. The Wasteland is dangerous, certainly, and frequently cruel, populated by institutions and individuals willing to commit genuine atrocities in pursuit of their own particular vision of survival or restoration. But it's also, consistently, populated by people still trying, in whatever small, imperfect ways remain available to them, to build something resembling genuine community and connection out of the wreckage left behind. That tension between devastation and persistent, stubborn hope has remained the franchise's truest, most consistent emotional core across nearly 30 years. Regardless of which specific studio happened to be building any particular installment, regardless of how dramatically the underlying technology and gameplay mechanics evolved across that same span of time. Let's spend a little more time, too, with the franchise's particular relationship to maps and exploration design. Since the actual physical layout of each game's world reveals its own quiet storytelling logic once you start paying close attention to it, Fallout 3's capital wasteland was deliberately designed around a hub and spoke structure radiating outward from the ruins of Washington, D.C. itself, allowing the development team to use real, recognizable landmarks as natural waypoints guiding player exploration without requiring heavy-handed map markers or explicit guidance. Fallout New Vegas took a somewhat different geographic approach, structuring its world around the actual flow of Interstate 15 and the surrounding desert terrain, reflecting Obsidian's research using genuine geological survey data we discussed earlier in our journey tonight. Fallout 4's Commonwealth, meanwhile, used Boston's distinctive, often confusing street layout as a deliberate design feature rather than an obstacle, embracing the city's notoriously winding, non-grid-based road system as a way of making exploration feel genuinely disorienting and unfamiliar, mirroring the player character's own experience of waking up in a transformed, unrecognizable version of a city they once called home. There's something quietly clever about each game choosing a distinct geographic philosophy that reinforces its particular narrative themes, rather than simply applying the same generic open-world structure across every installment regardless of setting. A game about waking up after 2 centuries of cryogenic sleep benefits considerably from a disorienting, confusing map layout that reinforces the player character's own sense of displacement. A game built around grand-scale faction conflict over critical infrastructure benefits from a more legible, hub-centered structure that makes the strategic importance of locations like Hoover Dam immediately apparent through pure geographic logic. It's the kind of design consideration that most players likely never consciously notice during actual gameplay, experiencing it purely as intuitive feel rather than deliberate, calculated design choice. But it represents yet another layer of the same patient, thoughtful craftsmanship that's defined this entire franchise across nearly 3 decades of continuous development. Let's spend just a little more time appreciating how thoroughly this franchise has trusted its audience throughout its entire history, since that underlying trust connects nearly everything we've explored together across this whole long evening. Trusting players to find secrets without explicit guidance. Trusting players to sit with morally ambiguous faction choices without demanding a simple, comfortable resolution. Trusting players to read environmental storytelling without requiring constant, explicit narration. Trusting players to actually care enough about a fictional wasteland's smallest, most easily overlooked details to spend literal hours, as we have together tonight, simply talking through everything that's been quietly hidden within it. That sustained trust, extended consistently across nearly 30 years by dozens of different creative teams who never had any guarantee it would be reciprocated, represents perhaps the truest, simplest explanation for why this particular fictional universe has managed to remain so consistently beloved across so much time, so much change, and so many different hands helping to shape it along the way. Let's spend a little more time thinking about how this franchise has approached the simple act of naming things, since names throughout the wasteland carry far more weight than they might initially appear to on first glance. Settlements are frequently named with a kind of weary, dark humor, communities calling themselves things that acknowledge their own precarious circumstances rather than projecting false optimism. Characters often carry names that hint at their function or fate well before the player ever learns their full story, a subtle storytelling technique that rewards players who pay close attention to these small details from their very first introduction to any given character. Even faction names themselves carry deliberate weight. The New California Republic's official, almost bureaucratic-sounding title contrasting sharply against Caesar's Legion's deliberately ancient, conquest-oriented branding, each name choice reinforcing the underlying philosophy and self-image of the organization carrying it. Let's spend a little more time, too, considering how the franchise has approached its treatment of addiction and substance use throughout various games, since this represents one of the more consistently mature, thoughtfully handled thematic threads running across the entire series. CHEMS, the franchise's collective term for various performance-enhancing and recreational substances scattered throughout the wasteland, are presented with a notable lack of simple moralizing, offering genuine, sometimes significant gameplay benefits while simultaneously carrying real risk of addiction and corresponding negative consequences if used carelessly or excessively. It's a design philosophy that treats players as capable of handling nuanced, morally complicated subject matter without requiring heavy-handed messaging explicitly telling them how to feel about any particular choice. Companion characters throughout multiple games struggle visibly with addiction storylines of their own, handled with a degree of empathy and complexity that avoids both glamorizing substance abuse and reducing it to simple cautionary tale territory, instead presenting addiction as a genuinely difficult, deeply human struggle that doesn't always resolve neatly or completely by a given character's questline conclusion. Let's close this particular stretch of reflection by considering one final time just how unusual it is for any creative franchise to maintain this level of thematic and tonal consistency across nearly 30 years, multiple development studios, and such enormous technological transformation. Most long-running franchises eventually drift considerably from their original creative identity, gradually reshaped by commercial pressure, changing audience expectations, and the simple difficulty of maintaining a coherent creative vision across that much accumulated time and personnel turnover. Fallout has certainly evolved considerably since 1997, shifting from isometric turn-based combat to fully realized first-person action, expanding from a relatively small, niche cult following to a genuinely massive global audience, reinforced by a successful television adaptation. And yet, somehow, underneath all that surface-level transformation, the franchise has maintained a remarkably consistent commitment to morally complex storytelling, dark comedic tonal balance, patient environmental world-building, and a genuine, sustained respect for player curiosity and exploration. That consistency, maintained across so much change, represents perhaps the single most impressive achievement in this entire franchise's long, strange, quietly remarkable history. Let's spend just a little more time considering the relationship between scarcity and storytelling throughout this franchise. Since the persistent sense of resource scarcity running through nearly every Fallout game does more narrative work than it might initially seem to on the surface. Ammunition runs low, clean water is genuinely difficult to find. Medical supplies require careful rationing rather than casual use. This persistent scarcity isn't simply a difficulty mechanic bolted onto the experience for the sake of challenge. It's a foundational piece of the franchise's broader thematic commitment to depicting genuine post-apocalyptic hardship rather than a sanitized, consequence-free version of devastation. Every time a player chooses to use a precious stim pack or fire an increasingly rare round of ammunition, that choice carries a small echo of the larger questions these games keep asking about what's worth spending, what's worth saving, and what survival actually costs people forced to live through genuinely scarce circumstances rather than simply visiting them temporarily as tourists. Let's spend some time too with the way different games throughout the franchise have handled their respective capital cities or central hub locations. Since these major settlements have consistently functioned as a kind of thematic anchor for whatever particular game they appear within, Diamond City in Fallout 4 represents relative order and structured governance amid the Commonwealth's surrounding chaos, even while harboring its own internal tensions regarding synthetic humans and outsider prejudice. The New Vegas Strip represents glittering excess and carefully maintained illusion, an artificial paradise of neon lights and gambling halls, deliberately insulated from the genuine hardships surrounding it just beyond its heavily guarded gates. Megaton, the small settlement built quite literally around an unexploded nuclear bomb throughout much of Fallout 3, represents something considerably more precarious. An entire community whose continued survival depends on a single object that could, at any moment, be detonated either by accident or by deliberate malice. A literal embodiment of the constant, low-grade existential anxiety that defines so much of life throughout this franchise's various wastelands. That particular Megaton scenario deserves a moment of additional appreciation on its own terms, since it represents one of the more thoughtful pieces of central hub design found anywhere in the franchise. An entire functioning town, complete with shops, a saloon, and a small permanent population, has been built directly around the crater left by an unexploded atomic bomb, its residents having collectively decided, for reasons of practicality, superstition, or simple resignation, that the bomb itself has become something closer to a religious icon than a genuine ongoing threat. Players are eventually given the choice to either defuse that bomb, preserving the town and its residents, or detonate it entirely, destroying the settlement and everyone living there in exchange for a substantial reward from a separate, considerably less scrupulous faction interested in seeing Megaton erased. It's exactly the kind of morally weighted, consequence-driven choice that's defined this franchise since its earliest days, presenting players with a decision that carries genuine, irreversible weight, rather than simply offering a token illusion of meaningful choice within an otherwise predetermined narrative structure. Let's pause for a while longer on the subject of music and sound, because there's more worth saying about how thoroughly these games have used licensed, archival recordings to build atmosphere, rather than relying purely on original orchestral scoring, the way most major game franchises typically do. Each game's curated radio playlist functions almost like its own character, distinct enough between entries that longtime fans can often recognize which specific game they're listening to within just a few notes, purely based on which particular selection of vintage recordings the development team chose to feature. That curatorial choice requires its own kind of careful, patient attention, someone on each development team spending considerable time researching and selecting period-appropriate recordings that would have plausibly survived into this fictional, irradiated future, then securing the licensing rights necessary to actually include that music within a commercial product. It's a layer of craft that happens almost entirely behind the scenes, invisible to players unless they specifically stop to think about where that music actually came from, and yet it does enormous work shaping the specific emotional texture of each individual game's particular version of the wasteland. Let's spend a little more time, too, with the way these games have handled difficulty and player failure, since the franchise's approach to character death and consequence has remained notably more punishing than many contemporary role-playing games, particularly within the original isometric era. Combat in the earliest Fallout games could be genuinely unforgiving, with a poorly built character facing real, permanent consequences for careless engagement with hostile enemies. That difficulty wasn't simply an artifact of technical limitations either. It reflected a deliberate design philosophy carried over from the tabletop role-playing traditions that originally inspired the franchise. The conviction that genuine stakes and genuine consequence make exploration and decision-making feel meaningfully weighted in a way that a more forgiving, consequence-free system simply can't replicate. Later games have generally softened this approach somewhat, offering considerably more accessible difficulty options and more forgiving save systems, but that underlying tension between accessibility and genuine consequence has remained a quiet, ongoing conversation throughout the franchise's entire development history, different teams making different calls about exactly where that balance should sit for any given installment. Let's also spend a moment considering how thoroughly these games have committed to letting environments tell stories without ever requiring a single line of spoken dialogue or written text to do so. A burned-out building with scorch marks radiating from a particular doorway tells its own story purely through visual composition. A skeleton positioned beside an empty whiskey bottle, and a faded photograph suggests an entire unspoken history of grief and isolation. This particular storytelling technique, sometimes called environmental storytelling within the broader game design community, has become such a standard expectation across the entire industry today that it's easy to forget just how much careful, deliberate craft goes into making it actually work. Every single object placement in scenes like these represents a series of small, deliberate creative choices, considering not just what story a particular tableau is meant to convey, but also how a player approaching from any given angle, at any given pace, will actually perceive and interpret that careful arrangement of objects and lighting. It's a discipline that demands genuine visual storytelling instincts, independent of any traditional dialogue or narration, and the Fallout franchise has consistently demonstrated some of the finest examples of this particular craft found anywhere in the medium. Let's spend a little more time now with a handful of additional small details scattered throughout the franchise that haven't come up yet tonight. The kind of scattered, miscellaneous pieces of trivia that don't necessarily fit neatly into any single chapter of this story, but still deserve a place somewhere in our wandering. Throughout Fallout 3, there's a recurring quest involving an android character, and the eventual reveal of that character's true nature draws direct inspiration from classic science fiction storytelling traditions, exploring questions of artificial consciousness and identity, themes the franchise would return to repeatedly in subsequent games, most notably through Nick Valentine's storyline in Fallout 4, and the broader societal debate surrounding synthetic humans that runs throughout that entire game's central conflict. It's interesting to trace how a single thematic seed planted relatively early in the franchise's three-dimensional era continued growing and developing across subsequent games, eventually becoming central enough to an entire game's plot that it directly shapes which faction a player ultimately chooses to align with by the story's conclusion. The franchise's approach to humor through item descriptions and flavor text deserves its own moment of appreciation too, since these games have consistently used even the smallest, most mundane inventory items as opportunities for small jokes and world-building details. A piece of pre-war junk that serves no mechanical purpose beyond crafting materials might still carry a small, carefully written description hinting at some larger, unstated story about the object's original owner or purpose. It's a level of craft that easily goes unnoticed during normal gameplay, since most players are primarily focused on whether an item is useful for crafting or combat, rather than reading every single flavor text description scattered throughout their inventory. But it represents another consistent thread of that same patient, detail-oriented care we've spent this entire evening exploring together. Let's spend some more time reflecting on the deliberate pacing philosophy that's defined exploration throughout this franchise since its earliest days, because there's something worth appreciating about how consistently these games have resisted the urge to constantly direct player attention toward explicit objectives. Unlike many modern open-world games that rely heavily on constant map markers, quest trackers, and explicit guidance systems designed to ensure players never feel lost or uncertain about where to go next, Fallout games have generally maintained a commitment to rewarding genuine, undirected exploration, hiding some of their most interesting content in locations that exist completely outside any quest marker or explicit guidance system. This design philosophy places considerable trust in players' own curiosity and patience, trusting that a meaningful percentage of any given audience will choose to wander away from the obvious, marked path specifically because something on the horizon looked interesting, rather than because any explicit game system told them to investigate it. That design philosophy connects directly back to everything we've discussed throughout this entire journey tonight. The hidden phone numbers, the buried literary references, the secret nested arcade games, the still undiscovered mysteries somewhere within Fallout 4's world. None of it would matter. None of it would be worth the considerable development time and resources required to build if these games hadn't also been carefully designed from the ground up to reward exactly the kind of patient, curious exploration necessary to actually discover any of it. The secrets and the exploration philosophy that makes finding them possible are genuinely inseparable from one another, two halves of the same underlying creative commitment that's defined this franchise since a lone programmer first started building an isometric engine in his spare time more than 3 decades ago. Let's spend a little more time now considering the relationship between this franchise and the broader genre of post-apocalyptic fiction more generally, since Fallout didn't emerge from nowhere but rather drew deliberately from a long, rich tradition of apocalyptic storytelling that predates the franchise by decades. We've already touched on the direct influence of Wasteland, Interplay's earlier post-nuclear game that originally inspired the entire project, before licensing complications forced the team toward building something new. Beyond that direct gaming lineage, the franchise has consistently drawn visual and tonal inspiration from mid-20th century science fiction, literature, and film, the kind of pulpy, often delightfully campy nuclear anxiety media that proliferated throughout the genuine Cold War era. These games are satirizing. That deliberate grounding in authentic period-appropriate source material, rather than simply imagining a generic, ahistorical apocalypse, gives the franchise's world-building a specificity and texture that considerably more generic post-apocalyptic media often lacks, since every visual and tonal choice throughout the games can be traced back to some genuine historical or cultural touchstone from that specific mid-century moment. Let's spend some final time now considering one more thread worth appreciating: The way this franchise has handled the concept of legacy and inheritance within its own narrative structures, something that feels particularly fitting to dwell on this late into such a long exploration of the franchise's own real-world development legacy. Throughout multiple games, player characters find themselves directly connected to previous generations of Wasteland survivors, whether through direct genetic lineage, as with the Chosen One's connection to the original Vault Dweller across the first two games, or through more thematic structural echoes, as with Fallout 4's sole survivor searching for a lost child while simultaneously discovering an entire underground society built around questions of inheritance, continuation, and what responsibilities, if any, one generation owes to the next. It's a theme that resonates rather beautifully with everything we've spent tonight, exploring about the franchise's own real-world development history, successive teams of developers, working decades apart, inheriting a creative vision from people who came before them, and choosing, again and again, to honor and expand that inheritance rather than discard or fundamentally betray it. There's a quiet symmetry in that, a franchise about survivors carefully tending to what previous generations built and left behind, made by successive generations of developers who've spent nearly 30 years doing precisely that same thing with the fictional universe itself. Tim Kane's four-word opening line. Joel Burgess's literary tribute hidden inside an unremarkable house. Josh Sawyer's commitment to morally complex faction writing under an impossibly compressed development timeline. Todd Howard's still unconfirmed, still unfound secret somewhere within Fallout 4's enormous world. Each individual contribution, layered carefully on top of everything that came before it, building slowly and patiently across decades into something considerably larger and more meaningful than any single person or team could have created entirely on their own. Let's spend just a few final minutes together wandering through one last collection of smaller observations before we truly let this evening close, because there's still a little more worth saying about why a franchise built around devastation has managed to feel, across nearly 3 decades, less like a story about endings and more like a story about quiet, patient continuation. Every wasteland settlement we've discussed tonight, every vault, every faction, every companion working through their own grief and survival, represents some version of the same basic question repeated endlessly across different games and different writing teams. Given everything that's been lost, what's actually worth holding on to, and what's worth letting go? It's a question that the franchise has never answered the same way twice, and that inconsistency feels deliberate rather than careless. The Brotherhood of Steel's answer involves careful technological stewardship. The NCR's answer involves rebuilding democratic bureaucracy, however imperfectly. Caesar's Legion's answer involves brutal, disciplined conquest modeled after ancient history. The Institute's answer involves scientific advancement pursued in near-total secrecy. None of these answers are presented as obviously correct, and the franchise has consistently trusted players to sit with that ambiguity rather than handing them an easy, comfortable resolution. There's something almost meditative about a video game franchise willing to ask the same fundamental question repeatedly across nearly 30 years without ever insisting on a single, definitive answer, instead allowing each individual player to reach their own conclusions through the specific choices they make across dozens of hours of exploration and decision-making. Let's spend a moment longer with the smaller, quieter wasteland communities scattered throughout these games too, the ones that never become the focus of any major faction conflict or central storyline, the kind of settlement a player might stumble across purely by accident while wandering between two more significant locations. These smaller communities, built by the writing and design teams with considerably less narrative weight than the major factions we've spent so much time discussing tonight, still consistently receive the same careful attention to detail that defines everything else we've explored together. A handful of survivors banding together around a single working water pump. A small trading outpost built from salvaged pre-war shipping containers. A isolated farm struggling against raiders and environmental hazards with only a handful of residents to defend it. These smaller stories rarely receive the same player attention as the franchise's larger, more dramatic narrative beats, and yet they're built with the same underlying philosophy of careful, patient world-building that's defined this entire universe since its earliest days. There's something worth appreciating in that consistency, The idea that even the smallest, most easily overlooked corners of these enormous game worlds receive genuine creative attention from the people building them, rather than simply existing as generic, interchangeable filler content meant to pad out a map's total square footage. It mirrors in a way everything we've discussed tonight about hidden secrets and Easter eggs, the same underlying philosophy applied at a slightly different scale, the conviction that every single piece of a game world, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, deserves the same careful, considered craftsmanship as the most prominent, attention-grabbing content. Let's close, finally, by returning one more time to where we began this entire journey together, that small Interplay office in the early 1990s, where a single programmer spent months working largely alone on an engine that would eventually become something far larger and more culturally significant than he could have possibly anticipated at the time. There's a quiet, satisfying symmetry in tracing a line from that lonely, uncertain beginning all the way to where this franchise stands today, nearly 30 years later, having survived multiple corporate ownership changes, complete technological reinventions, a canceled third installment, an 18-month development sprint that somehow produced one of its most beloved entries, and a live-action television adaptation that introduced an entirely new generation of audiences to a universe built originally on a budget that modern game development would consider almost impossibly modest. That kind of sustained, multi-decade creative legacy doesn't happen by accident. It happens because, at every single critical juncture along the way, the people responsible for carrying this universe forward chose patience and genuine care over convenience and shortcuts. They chose to hide a poem inside an unremarkable house. They chose to keep writing alternate dialogue for players who built deliberately unconventional, low-intelligence characters. They chose to give a previously cut companion character a genuine, fully realized story years after the original game's rushed development forced his removal. They chose again and again, decade after decade, studio after studio, to treat this fictional wasteland as something genuinely worth caring for, rather than simply a commercial property to be exploited for guaranteed, predictable returns. Before we close completely, let's spend just a little more time with a final handful of reflections, gathered loosely, the kind of closing thoughts that don't necessarily need their own tightly structured chapter, but feel worth including in these last few quiet minutes together. Think back for a moment to Vault Boy himself, that cheerfully smiling mascot born from a late-night drive home and a half-remembered image of the Monopoly Man. He's appeared on the cover of every mainline game since 1997. His expression never wavering, regardless of how catastrophic the circumstances depicted around him happen to be. There's something almost philosophical buried inside that consistency, a character whose entire defining trait is an inability, or perhaps a refusal, to stop smiling no matter what happens to him. It's easy to read that as simple dark comedy, and on one level it certainly is. But there's another way to read it too, a small, persistent symbol of resilience stamped onto the front of every single game in this franchise, a reminder that even in the absolute worst possible circumstances, even after the world itself has ended, something in the human spirit, however cartoonishly exaggerated, keeps finding a way to smile and keep moving forward anyway. Think, too, about Ron Perlman's voice, opening nearly every entry in this franchise across nearly 30 years with those same 4 words, "War never changes." It's a phrase that's become so familiar to longtime fans that it risks losing its actual weight through sheer repetition, the way any sufficiently iconic line eventually becomes more recognizable as branding than as genuine considered meaning. But sit with it for a moment, the way we've been sitting with so many small details throughout this entire evening together. War never changes. 4 words, written by a single programmer working largely alone in a small office decades ago, words he himself has described as essentially his only direct writing contribution to that very first game. And yet those 4 words have opened nearly every subsequent entry in this franchise, narrated by the same distinctive voice, across multiple console generations, multiple development studios, multiple corporate owners, and now, most recently, an entire live-action television adaptation reaching millions of viewers who may never have touched a single one of these games directly. That's the kind of legacy that very few creative works ever achieve, a single sentence, written under uncertain circumstances by someone who had no way of knowing whether the project he was working on would even survive long enough to ship, somehow becoming durable enough to outlive its original context entirely, carried forward by successive generations of creative teams who recognized something worth preserving in those four simple words and chose, again and again, to keep using them rather than replace them with something newer or more contemporary. Let's think, finally, about all the players themselves. Since we've spent so much of tonight focused on developers and their choices without spending quite as much time considering the people on the other side of all this careful craftsmanship, the millions of individual players across nearly 30 years who've actually wandered through these wastelands, discovered these secrets, and carried these stories forward in their own memories long after they've set down the controller or closed the game. Every hidden phone number we discussed tonight only matters because someone, somewhere, eventually dialed it. Every literary reference hidden inside an unremarkable house only matters because someone, somewhere, eventually walked through that door and recognized what they were looking at. The developers built the secrets, but it's the players, generation after generation, who've actually given those secrets their meaning by finding them, sharing them, and keeping their memory alive long after any individual playthrough has ended. There's something genuinely lovely about that ongoing, collaborative relationship between creator and audience, sustained now across nearly 3 decades, a relationship built on mutual trust, developers trusting that someone will eventually go looking for what they've hidden, players trusting that something worth finding is actually out there if they're patient enough to look. It's the same fundamental relationship that's defined storytelling for as long as humans have been telling each other stories, a willingness from both sides to invest genuine care and attention into something neither party can fully control or predict the outcome of, trusting instead that the act of careful creation and careful discovery, repeated patiently enough over a long enough period of time, will eventually produce something genuinely meaningful. And with that, our journey through the wasteland comes to its close for tonight. We've traveled from a lone programmer's spare bedroom experiments in the early 90s, all the way through a live-action television adaptation reaching millions of viewers more than 3 decades later. We've uncovered hidden faces inside desktop icons, secret arcade games nested inside other secret arcade games, literary tributes buried inside unremarkable houses, and a mystery that, as far as anyone can confirm, remains genuinely unsolved even now. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whatever time it happens to be where you are, I hope this slow, patient wander through one of gaming's most carefully built worlds has been exactly the kind of quiet, restful company you were hoping for. If you made it this far with me tonight, genuinely, thank you for spending this much time wandering through the wasteland together. If any of these stories surprised you, or if there's a particular Fallout secret or moment from your own time exploring these games that stuck with you over the years, I'd love to hear about it down in the comments whenever you wake up. And if you enjoyed settling into this kind of slow, detailed journey through gaming history, consider hitting that like button before you drift off, and subscribing if you'd like to wander through another world like this one together sometime soon. Sleep well and stay safe out there in whatever wasteland you happen to be dreaming about tonight. Good night, Wanderer. Wherever you are, however late it's gotten, sleep finds you easier now, wrapped in the quiet hum of a wasteland that never stopped being worth exploring, one patient secret at a time, for nearly 30 years and counting. And if, somewhere down the road, you find yourself back in that wasteland again, controller in hand, screen glowing softly in a dark room, remember that everything we talked through tonight is still sitting there, patient as ever, waiting to be rediscovered, the same way it's been waiting, quietly, for nearly 30 years now, for anyone curious enough to come looking. Sleep well. The wasteland will keep. Take one more slow breath. Let your shoulders fully relax, and let everything else drift quietly away now. Good night, rest easy now, and thank you again, genuinely, for spending this entire, long, quiet evening wandering through the wasteland together with me.